So, I'm kinda late to the party here, but as you can guess, I have a lot of thoughts on Persona 3 Reload. Or at least when it comes to the story, characters, and overall artistry, so strap in for ladies' typical over-analysis of everything! Because, you know, for better or for worse, Reload definitely evolved the general aesthetic and feel of the PS2 era Persona 3. The characters especially, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I personally loved re-experiencing the story with Reload's take on it, and I do want to thank Atlus for a copy of this incredible game. The slight changes were quite interesting and even refreshing in many ways. And yeah, you are hearing that from me, one of the Persona 3 FES shills. Because if you're at least somewhat familiar with my channel, then you probably know P3 is my favorite in the entire series, but fun fact that only the OGs would know is that the first video I ever made in my life and uploaded to YouTube was a defense of Persona 3 FES's game design and the meaning it added to the narrative and themes. I privated the first version of that video ages ago, but oh my god, I'm just reminiscing looking back at this thumbnail. So with that said, I'm of the mind that not every change in Reload has been for the better, but at the same time, I firmly believe that plenty of meaningful additions and differences in this game deserve to be talked about. Though before we really start diving into the details, I'd first like to share an idea that I hope you'll keep in mind while you watch this video. You see, something I'm very grateful to have learned all throughout my childhood and adolescence and just means a lot to me is this pretty fundamental concept pertaining to art, or anything creative really, that I think oftentimes gets lost in all the discourse over what is the best version or the definitive version of insert whatever piece of media you want here. So when it comes to performing live concerts or shows for like an orchestra, band, theater troupe, or just any ensemble really, something you come to learn is that every cast and even every performance itself will create a different experience, whether minuscule or major, even when it's all just the same exact repertoire. So let's take the Phantom of the Opera musical, for instance. Or just think about one of your favorite songs. But now consider all the different adaptations, versions, and so on that have been made, recorded, covered, and performed by countless different groups and individuals over the years, all with different takes on the exact same thing. Or in other words, what I'm getting at is the performance given by any one particular actor or soloist can never be perfectly imitated by someone else because every single person is unique, with different life experiences that affect what they bring to the table. And that's kind of the beauty of art. A new version or performance of something doesn't invalidate the original, nor the other versions, you know? Everyone's gonna have their own subjective preference, so take voiceover for instance. It's okay to like one over the other, though for me, I have such love for the entire new cast of Reload while still appreciating the OGs from FES too. This isn't to say criticism isn't warranted or allowed though, because that is an important part of the discourse surrounding any artistic medium. You will see I'm quite critical myself in certain parts of this video. On a related note, you know what makes me kinda sad? That there's often this tendency to equate anything different with bad. And believe me, I can understand how it can be hard to appreciate differences when that attachment to the original is still there. I myself am still super attached to FES, but personally I'm quite open to exploring new horizons, and I just hope others can learn to enjoy doing so too. I'm not trying to force anyone to think a certain way, but I do think there are benefits to adopting this sort of mindset when it comes to anything artistic, especially considering how popular remakes and adaptations are nowadays, since I think it can save you from a lot of mental anguish and anger when things aren't exactly the same as you remember. But I guess this was all just a really long preface to explain my approach to Reload, which was me just wanting to let this remake of my favorite game of all time stand on its own 2 feet. I don't like going into things with the intention of picking it apart, so as long as I feel like the differences serve some kind of purpose, which I very much think Reloads do, I'm pretty chill with changes to things. Now, please bear with me when it comes to the structure of this video. I've finally settled on just going over the overarching differences I noticed between Persona 3 FES and Reload first, before moving on to individual sections for each of the characters. Anyway, this intro has been going on long enough, so let's finally dive into the actual analysis. First off, just some brief comments on the gameplay. So I don't feel like I have any particularly compelling insights to share, especially since I'm mostly a characterization, storytelling, symbolism, yada yada kind of channel anyway. But as someone who did play the entire game with tactics only, yeah, the FES head in me couldn't resist, guys. I just want to say I was disappointed that the party members never used the shift mechanics themselves. So yes, I went the whole game with no shift. Nor did they ever guard unless the enemy completely blocked or reflected all their attack types, which was definitely frustrating at times. I did play on normal though, so none of these things caused actual trouble in my reload journey, thankfully. Though a change I really liked in this game is how every single character now fulfills some sort of nice niche as a party member, so it doesn't feel like completely one-sided in how helpful some are than others. Previously, Akihiko! I'm the kind of player that uses every person in the party throughout the game regardless, but it's still so cool seeing Junpei as a crit machine now, or even something as simple as making sure Ken and Koro have light and dark skills that can deal damage now, not to mention some additional passive utilities added. I'll elaborate on some gameplay as symbolically necessary in certain characters' individual sections, but otherwise I don't really have anything else to say in general, especially since the game mechanics like AI party members, tired status, and a few other things didn't make it into the remake. But to transition to the more literary analysis side of things, I got 2 generally overarching observations. The first of those is that Reload is much less abstract, for lack of a better descriptor, than PS2 era Persona 3. This can be seen in the visuals as well as its overall written storytelling. For instance, right from the start, let's take the OG Persona 3 opening super abstract shapes and animations, along with all the weighty philosophical quotes running on screen. It's all just very highly theoretical stuff, but then juxtapose all of that with Reload's opening and its way more straightforward depictions of people's anatomy, facial expressions, background settings, and so on. Changes that carried over to all the new animated cutscenes too. I mean, just look at all of PS2 P3's wacky proportions and angles. Like, I'm not an actual artist, so I don't know if I'm describing the following correctly, but the style strikes me as incredibly impressionistic compared to the much more standard anime style in Reload. So basically my point is that P3 Reload's cutscenes are more straightforward in what they convey, as well as in how they actually do it. There's no mistaking anything or really any difficulty in understanding what's happening on screen. And the accompanying subtitles and even voiceover only adds to this perception, which I don't think is an entirely bad thing. Sure, I admittedly appreciate and vastly prefer the more unsettling vibe of the original cutscenes. The art style and direction of them were just very unique and mysterious. But there's no denying that Reload's new direction has made everything much more accessible. And longtime viewers here know that disability accessibility is really important to me, as I have one of my own. So seeing Reload including subtitles and full voiceover even in the animated cutscenes is a nice addition for those who may be hard of hearing or seeing and so on. But yeah, it's not just the animated visuals and cutscenes, but also the overall written exposition in Reload that's more deliberate and clear as well. The dialogue was definitely touched up, either clarifying things or adding new lines completely. I've heard that some of these changes were originally made in Portable, and I've only played the FEMC route once myself, so I'm definitely more shaky when it comes to Reload and P3P discrepancies, though I've done my best to sorta go back and double check when necessary. But allow me to toot my own horn when it comes to FES. So given the other huge mega analyses I've done on that version of Persona 3, I like to think I've memorized most of the major narrative scenes completely by heart, meaning I caught on right away when Reload introduced entirely new scenes and or lines for things like the persona suppression pills, the Kirijo experiments and the connection to Strega, apathy syndrome, and other background lore. For instance, Shinji's pain from the pills is introduced and shown much earlier in Reload. Now, I'm saving my more detailed thoughts on these kinds of change-ups for the individual character sections, so to get back to my overall point here, there's just way less ambiguity or leaving it up to the player to read between the lines in Reload. Or in other words, being cognizant of subtext is simply less of a requirement now to fully grasp the characters, cast dynamics, overall themes, and the actual narrative. There's definitely a big part of me that misses that ambiguity of Persona 3 FES. I found it fun having to piece together some of the lore since vital information and reveals were often not in chronological order, nor attached to each other in a step-by-step logical progression sort of way. Hopefully that last part makes sense. Sorry, I'm not very good at explaining things sometimes. Though, to be absolutely fair to Reload, these changes mean it technically does have the benefit of more deliberate foreshadowing. Like, take the apathy syndrome concept. It received way more spotlight in the main narrative's dialogue in this remake. Most notable to me were the added moments chatting with Junpei about it in the early months, but the writers definitely went further than just that and made sure to consistently bring it back up throughout the game. Such an example was first added in P3 Portable, I believe, and is now in Reload too. It's during the track meet in August. You see, one of the rival school's athletes comes down with apathy syndrome, and the protag Kazushi and Yuko all share genuine worry over it. In contrast, apathy syndrome in FES was mostly relegated only to optional text, like the news on the TV, and NPC dialogue, even though it plays such a huge part in P3's world building. By the way, I have a brief tangent on all the added NPC dialogue in Reload, but I'm gonna save that bit for the timestamp shown on screen right now. But since we're still on this topic of more deliberate plot points, I'd like to talk about how Reload substantially shifted the game's overall tone as well, which can be seen within the first 10 minutes even. You see, the first night's walk to the dorms from the train station actually includes the protag's inner thoughts, albeit they are optional. But I just can't understate my reaction here. I vastly prefer Fez's take on this scene in particular, just because I feel like Reload allowing us to actively control the character and see what he thinks about the coffins now just kinda downplays, arguably even changes, the completely aloof demeanor that's present in the original PS2 cutscenes, as well as in the first Persona 3 movie. So this is in large part adaptation interpretation, but I liked that the latter further implied that the protag has already been aware of the Dark Hour prior to returning to Tatsumi Port Island. So regardless, the aloofness and apathy I find so thematically important to P3 given the main mysterious illness that plagues society. You know, apathy syndrome is just missing. So I find Reload's take on this intro to be notably less inspiring. But to kind of go back to an earlier point, the remake's cutscenes have been essentially stripped of all their mystery. The result is Reload having this lackluster and even missing sinister feel that characterized the early months of the OG Persona 3. The most notable example of this to me is the night of the first full moon, where some random NPC is shown transforming into a shadow for the first time. Reload didn't even keep this as an animated cutscene. Meanwhile, I'm gonna play FES's version for you right now. Still, this isn't to say Reload's cutscenes aren't beautiful in their own right, and stylistically they do fit with the overall new look of Tatsumi Port Island in this modern engine. This goes for the shift in thematic emphasis in this game too. More on that very soon in my second overarching observation section, but okay, if you'd allow me to return to my tangent on the NPC dialogue first, I do have some really great things to say about it. First off, I need to thank the devs for this Trail Series-esque addition via graying out the bubbles of unchanged NPC dialogue. Seriously, every RPG needs quality of life like this. But more importantly, Reload added so many more lines than what was solely in FES, and I just completely fell in love with all the additional insight into character personalities and especially the cast dynamics. You see, there are slight changes to the seating positions and an overall wider variety of them that you can find these characters in now, which actually foreshadows relationships at times and also just makes C's feel closer overall. Here's a brief example. Compare the end of September in PS2 FES to that in the remake. We see Yukari starting to become closer to Mitsuru already via her willingness to sit next to her. The other party members have more to say about Shinji during the time he's with them, and even Shinji himself has more things to say, even if it's not much different from his usual spiel. And then there's also some existing dialogue from FES that has been rewritten for clarification. Like in the month prior to the Ken and Shinji confrontation, Yukari goes from saying, quote, "your environment really affects you," to, quote, "things that happen when you're little affect how you turn out." This nails home that what she's truly referring to is how Ken had to grow up so unbelievably fast because he no longer has a parental figure in his life. She's not just talking about the stress of their current situation, aka Caesar's current environment in having to fight the shadows. Again, I'm saving my deeper analysis on stuff like this for the character sections, so to wrap up this general NPC dialogue tangent, I truly appreciate how it just adds more life to C's as a cast, if you're willing to engage with it. But now let's move on to the second overarching evolution/change that I noticed. And that's how Persona 3 Reload has way less overt emphasis on Memento Mori and preoccupation with death as a symbol. Keyword here being overt. Instead, there's a lot more attention placed on C's creating connections and lasting memories with each other, with their loved ones. This shift in aesthetic can be seen as early as in Reload's marketing trailers, ones like this one that slow-mo'd all the fond memories the cast had together over the entire year. And once again, we can juxtapose the original Persona 3 opening to Persona 3 Reloads, both visually and musically. The latter in particular. Burn My Dread features grimmer lyrics, especially in its chorus, and while Full Moon Full Life echoes its P3 origins with a similar synth rhythm, once it reaches its own chorus, the lyrics are generally more hopeful instead. And again, I personally don't think either is necessarily better than the other, they just have different artistic direction and purpose. Even if I prefer the original PS2 opening, it doesn't mean I dislike Reload's Full Moon Full Life. I still think this opening is gorgeous. And to be clear, regarding the theme of creating and cherishing memories, I'm not trying to imply that this wasn't a key takeaway of P3 FES, because it absolutely was. The inevitability of death and the cherishing of life are two sides of the same coin after all. It's just, FES's presentation was so different. It wasn't so obviously direct, dare I say preachy, with the latter life lesson. And on a related note, Persona 3 FES developed a cast that felt more at distance with each other anyway, due to the AI party member mechanics and just the way the overall storytelling was executed. And since there was less downtime and slice of life moments for C's in FES, we feel that brooding and moody vibe in PS2 Persona 3 way more compared to Persona 3 Reload's overall brighter tone. And all that saturation, baby. But yeah, the whole slew of new activities and events that can be done in the dorm also negates a lot of that original gloomy feeling. More on this in the separate character sections as necessary, but to preview my overall take on these things, it's pretty clear these new activities weren't added merely so we'd have more things to do at night, but to also further characterize individual C's members. And arguably most importantly, have each of them establish more of a one-on-one dynamic with the protagonist, something that was hardly touched on back in FES and usually required us to just infer or assume based on subtext. So about that original Persona 3 cast dynamic, something that really stood out to me in my first ever playthrough of FES was how everyone from the main cast was involved in clubs or other activities outside of just C's. This was really relatable to me at the time since I played this the summer prior to my senior year in high school, and me and my closest friend group were sorta like C's. We all had our own responsibilities for different sports teams and other clubs like Science Olympiad, MUN, school newspaper, just to name some off the top of my head. And this was all on top of the one major thing that tied us all together, which was orchestra and band. So in Persona 3's case, I liked how it sold this kinda slow burn feel of building camaraderie even among people who might not have known each other otherwise. But I'm also just a sucker for the very different strangers coming together for a common goal feel in the first place, both in fiction and in real life when it comes to things like solidarity, social mobilization, and actual praxis of that, but that's a whole different topic. Back to OGP3, I get it's been common sentiment for decades at this point that many players would rather have party members be social links instead of the other students at school. So in other words, something more intimate like Persona 4 and Persona 5 social links. But for me, I like the fact that the Persona 3 protag makes connections with such a large number of people, all from such different circles from one another. Like, it's just a wider breadth, right? Okay, editing lady here. I get that P4 and P5 do have people from very different walks of life as well. It's just, my point here is that P3, just from sheer numbers, has more characters. It was also just fascinating to me to witness how flawed these characters were, and the realization as I kept dissecting Persona 3 in hindsight that they symbolically fit so perfectly with the Greek tragedian theming and its whole fatal flaw trope. And since P3 was my first ever Persona game, I was shocked at how accurate these characters were to their respective arcana, which, by the way, I think most of these arcana are misunderstood, not gonna lie, so please stay tuned for my eventual follow-up Persona 3 Arcana Explained video for all the non-party members! Though in the meantime, you can check out the one I did on the entire main cast. But to continue, I've always been a big fan of episodic anime, the kinds that explore a couple characters in one episode or two, then move on to completely new ones after. Usually the only thing tying everything together being the wandering protagonist. Like, I don't think I've ever mentioned this anywhere, but to this day, my favorite anime of all time is Mushishi. And the P3 social links and the takeaways you can still glean from them just give me a similar vibe. As a final anecdote, an experience that will always stay with me is my freshman orientation back in 2014. It was a 2.5-week backpacking trip with a group of 11 people, 9 other freshmen and 2 student leaders. That trip was life-changing for me. It taught me so much about self-efficacy, something I really needed at the time, but as it relates to P3 and this friend topic, I'll always cherish those 11 people that made the trip with me, and even though I've only stayed in regular touch with one person from that trip, they remain one of my closest and most trusted friends to this day, 10 whole years later. And this even though we've been living in different countries for years now. And the kicker is that we were in such different interest/social circles prior that I honestly doubt we would have become friends or even met if it wasn't for that trip. That experience came after my first playthrough of P3 FES, but it gave me an even greater appreciation for C's dynamic with each other. But I think I've been sorta tangenting for long enough, so at the end of the day, it's all just personal preference. Some people seek that one friend group where basically everyone knows everyone, so something more akin to Persona 4, while others might not mind so much having friends from a variety of different circles, all of whom might not even know one another. Now, to awkwardly transition back to the topic of Reload's new slice of life dorm stuff, Persona 3 FES had to rely more on subtext or sometimes even straight up headcanon that the cast did truly come to care about one another, even if you get the feeling they might not necessarily choose to hang out with each other in their free time. But Persona 3 Reload, on the other hand, well, it completely evolves the original concept and actually builds on the cast's dynamic and friendships, deliberately spelling out Caesar's closeness this time around. To reiterate one of my points from earlier, Reload was also very intentional in establishing a relationship between each individual C's member and the protagonist. And what's most notable is how each one of them made some kind of future plan/promise with him. Or well, they did if you got through their entire respective link episode or social link. Like, I'm being completely serious, guys. Everybody! So, Yukari, Junpei, Ken, Fuuka, Mitsuru, Akihiko, Aigis, and even sweet Koro-chan, all of them made a promise with the MC in the end. To throw out just a few examples, Akihiko finally gets to treat Protag to that meal, but he says MC's turn to pay it back to him will come around eventually. Then we have Mitsuru, who wants to take her motorcycle and go on a trip with Protag once C's has accomplished everything they need to do. Junpei gives him a baseball glove with the intention that they'll practice together, and so on for all the others. So, considering how the Answer DLC is confirmed now, I wonder if certain scenes will play out differently, or at the very least, hit different, since without going into any major spoilers, the Answer deals with the concept of grief and how everyone processes it differently, which is really significant in Japanese sociocultural context, and you can find my analysis on that here. But yeah, I just wouldn't be surprised if the DLC's dialogue is altered in certain parts in order to better reflect Reload's increased emphasis on everyone's individual relationships with the MC. But as for Caesar's cast dynamic as a whole, I'd like to highlight how often the main cast shows up in each other's scenes in Reload, especially with the study sessions and the guys' new Link episodes. One of the common complaints of FES was that it felt like the guys in particular weren't really friends with each other. I personally never bought into that, but I could see where people were coming from, so it's pretty cool that one of Reload's main missions was to address this. I did find it very wholesome seeing all the dudes hanging out across each other's respective Link episodes. Like the watermelon cracking one of Junpei's was a particular highlight for me, but I'm curious to know what your favorite group moment was in a Link episode, or study session, dorm activity, whatever, you get what I mean. Let me know in the comments. Anyway, given how most of these extra slice of life scenes are optional content, I think overall Reload did strike the best balance they possibly could for both old fans and new fans of Persona 3, since you could just not do them if you wanted to preserve the feel of PS2 P3. The new optional events do feel natural and in character to how Cs would feasibly interact though, which is a big relief honestly, since I was kinda worried, same with my buddies Bubble Tea and Big Clingy, that the additions could have ended up too bombastic and extroverted, like the Persona 4 cast's interactions, which, to be clear, fit its own game. It just wouldn't have been in character for the personalities of P3. Like, take how the study sessions play out. I love how fitting they are for Cs, since, aside from Junpei, the P3 cast as a whole is the most studious and academically achieving of the modern Persona parties. But to start wrapping up this massive section, the shift in narrative and thematic priority from Memento Mori to making memories truly affected the overall atmosphere of Persona 3 Reload, which I believe truly evolves it into something different from its origins, which actually gives it the room to stand on its own, while still staying true to that beloved cast and story we've come to love. But okay, so everything I went over so far was to basically set the stage for these character sections, starting with the girl who was in the direst need of more screen time. So I know I've spent the past 30 minutes reiterating how different doesn't necessarily equal bad, and people are gonna prefer different things. But you know what? Sorry but not sorry to any fans of OG Fuuka, but she's legit the only character I see as 100% unequivocally better in Reload. And it's not like I even had anything against her character in FES. For instance, I truly respect how well she symbolically fit the reverse and upright Priestess Arcana. But come on, she just felt non-existent narratively compared to the rest of the cast. With P3 Reload though, what a refreshing change, starting with her stilted original English dub. In stark contrast, Susie Young's voiceover is just so much more emotive, with the pitch itself giving a very different impression. You see, I've always been of the mind that Fuuka is the most overtly caring worrywart when it comes to every single one of her teammates, and these signs were in the original game. For instance, she partly blames herself for Shinji's death and is incredibly worried about Ken when he doesn't return to the dorms. And on top of that, so much of her NPC dialogue is centered on what the others, so Yukari, Junpei, and so on, must be feeling as they wade through their own respective character arcs. So I think the new voice direction really pays tribute to Fuuka's attentive and compassionate nature this time around. And speaking of, Reload even adds a new scene to show how good she is at understanding her new friend's underlying motives, looking past appearances, so to speak. Fuuka recognizes Yukari's innate kindness, which manifests as her healing capabilities. More on the scene between the two of them in the dedicated Yukari section later. There's an entirely new Tartarus scenario as well, which finally gives Fuuka's contributions to the team the recognition it deserves. On the equivalent day in P3 FES, the group is sent straight to Tartarus. There's no special introduction to Fuuka's power as navigator, nor any attention to her being a legit new member of the team at all. Meanwhile, in Reload, Ikutsuki brings out the brand new gear, and then we head to the tower to be led into 3rd mechanics via Fuuka's guidance. It's also very satisfying seeing Fuuka and Yukari's friendship expanded upon here in Reload's main narrative, as in beyond just what is shown in Fuuka's social link. Her feelings of being stifled at home are also given more attention. You see, in some altered NPC dialogue that wasn't originally in FES, Fuuka shares that she assumed she had to stay in the dorms on weekends, when in reality she can do whatever she wants, perhaps implying she didn't have much freedom back home. This also helps explain why she's so quick to accept Mitsuru's offer to join Cs. that it truly isn't her just being pressured into it. And since we're on this topic, I think it's pretty easy to forget Fuuka's backstory in FES since she has such little meaningful presence in the story. Also because her main struggle is so mundane compared to all her C's peers. As a brief refresher, her parents are the only ones in her family who aren't doctors, which has given rise to their inferiority complex, and that has translated into the high expectations they push on their daughter. But there are many players who can probably relate to this notion of parents attempting to live vicariously through their children. Anyway, I like to think there's more player interest in Fuuka now thanks to Reload upping her screen time, including the dorm activities, which I think go a long way for her in particular. They just inform us more on her personality. Like, let's take the final reading session and her desire to be able to communicate complex ideas to others in a digestible way, just like the sci-fi author. This means a lot when taking into account her responsibilities as navigator of seas. Of course she'd want to get better at relaying vital information during battle. And I also love how the gardening showcases her tendency to research all she can on the activities she picks up as a fellow nerd. Very relatable. And for Fuuka, this is especially true when the well-being of others are at stake. Basically, just like with her C's teammates, her obsession with learning the ins and outs of plants/gardening is just her way of showing how much she cares. But to start wrapping up Fuuka's section, characters with more mundane arcs will, I think understandably, almost always be the most left behind in terms of JRPGs. Players just tend to be naturally drawn to the more interesting and novel backstories, right? Regardless, I really appreciate Suzy Young's role in bringing Fuuka to life in Reload. Now this may come as a surprise, but I actually have quite a bit to say on Ikutsuki. Though I'd like to start with a question first. For those of you who've never played Persona 3 prior to Reload, were you suspicious of him right away? Or expecting him to be a traitor at any point? Or did he seem like a pretty harmless character to you? Sure, there's a pretty big elephant in the room in that he knows about the Dark Hour yet doesn't have a persona. But I just have to ask, because I couldn't help but notice all these tweaks in Reload that were seemingly meant to make him more normal? And perhaps less suspicious prior to his actual betrayal. One of these changes is his voice direction. He actually sounds like some normal dude this time around. Meanwhile, I feel like it was a pretty common sentiment among FES players that his unemotive voice made him seem suspicious early on, if not right from the beginning. But since he sounds like an actual person now, I feel like it's easier to buy into the idea that he's maybe just a comic relief NPC. Especially given some of the new scenes/lines that were specifically added in Reload. Like, one of the study sessions has Ikutsuki trading puns back and forth with Junpei. And since Junpei himself is a more generally likable character now, more on that in his own dedicated section, I feel like this rapport between the two, if you can call it that, does a lot in Ikutsuki's favor. Another example is this altered dialogue during the Yakushima trip. Apparently, Junpei and Ikutsuki were karaokeing together all night on the last day. So it's just small stuff like this that adds up in my view, and why it wouldn't surprise me if some new to P3 players found him a generally harmless dude. Okay, so quick warning, I'll be talking about P5 and P4 spoilers for the rest of the Ikutsuki section. So surely there must be a fair number of newcomers to P3 story who've only played Persona 5 and Persona 4 prior. So you know what I can't help but think of? How P5 and P4 had these older adult male guardian characters like Sojiro and Dojima, both whom have daughters, right? So what if we counted Aigis as Ikutsuki's daughter and... Wait, what? Please stop looking at me like that.
Bruh.
Okay, I see, fine. Pretend I never suggested the slot. Well, another thing that sets Persona 3 apart from P5 and P4 is how you're not actively on the lookout for a traitor or suspect. As in, those other two games prime the player to be suspicious of a traitor/killer all within the first couple hours. Meanwhile, there's no plotline like that introduced in Persona 3. Unless you want to count the Yukari being suspicious of Tartarus origins thing during the first few months. But even then, Persona 3 gives you plenty of answers by July, though in hindsight, it's a red herring. A new player has no real reason not to trust or take it at face value, though. Well, until months later when it's already too late. Oh, and just to be clear, by red herring, I mean the tape of Yukari's dad that's played at Yakushima. Also, to briefly return to the topic of comic relief NPC, I get that technically people who've played P4 would have Adachi as precedent, but something I feel singled out Ikutsuki from all these other adult counterparts was that he never truly felt relevant or helpful to the cast at any point in FES. Like, he didn't even have helpful intel, really. So in other words, he was essentially just a disposable non-character. In Reload, though, he's actually rather helpful to C's lore-wise. He gives them stronger equipment and the mechanism to utilize Thurgy and June, and given how the Yakushima trip is portrayed more positively in this remake compared to FES, it seems more significant that he's the one who suggests it. And Dojima and Sojiro are helpful guardians, and they don't end up being bad. But yeah, I'd just like to hear from any of you who were surprised by Ikutsuki's betrayal, or maybe didn't truly consider it until it was nearly upon you in the narrative. Or perhaps I have to accept a reality where it's just me that finds these slight changes to Ikutsuki fascinating. Like, despite everything I just said, you could also technically argue Reload added more foreshadowing or clues to his betrayal. Let's take the new scene where he rushes to leave the hospital during the protag's checkup. You know what also just happens to occur then? Us just stumbling upon Takaya at the Moonlight Bridge right after. So I'm pretty sure the implication here is that this is the moment Jin stole Ikutsuki's notes, the ones he mentioned when we fight him for the final time. The ones that clued him and Takaya in on the coming of Nyx so they could start the Doomsday cult. And awkward transition, but something else that lingered in the back of my mind was when Ikutsuki, of all people, introduced Shinji's posthumous and final Link episode. It just feels like Reload was trying to make Ikutsuki's betrayal feel more significant, or in other words, hit harder than the meh reaction I feel most FES players had. Like, at least for me, I honestly find it hard to call Ikutsuki's words here entirely disingenuous. And this is in spite of how much of a selfish kook he reveals himself to be in the end. Here, Ikutsuki says it'd be a shame if all of Shinji's stuff was just gathered and thrown out without someone, ideally someone close to him, sorting through all his belongings first. So, did Ikutsuki actually care about these kids on some level? Or is this him just putting on a facade when deep down he wants nothing to do with Caesar's grieving process? And it turns out I'm not the only one questioning the supposed complexity of Ikutsuki, since some in C's can't help but have similar thoughts. Fuuka, for example. After his betrayal, she can't help but wonder whether his puns were even genuine. Like, was this his actual humor? He's caught on camera laughing about it. But did he record himself doing so on purpose? So in other words, was it another part of the facade he thought he should play? Like, Fuuka ultimately raises the question, did any one of them actually know a real Ikutsuki at all? I just think it's pretty interesting to connect this to the strong Jungian influences of the Persona games. You know, that people have many different aspects to the persona and shadow, yet every single one does play a part in what makes a person distinctly themselves to some degree. Presentation is such a key part of how we're going to perceive and interpret things, so it's just crazy to me that Reload's subtle changes have me entertaining a line of thought I never once considered in my FES playthroughs. So the following two character sections are the ones that mean the most to me, not gonna lie. You see, one of the major things that captured my attention when I first played this game over 10 years ago was the lack of good first impressions made by a huge chunk of the cast, including the social links, with Junpei and Yukari being the primary examples of this in the main party. Now, before I dive into detail on these two characters, I'd first like to talk about Persona 3's Greek tragedy thematic and how this relates to the other games. So, each of the Hashino personas have their own very distinct aesthetic theming. Persona 4 leans into the popular archetypes discussed and covered in Japanese pop culture of the 2000s, hence the television/TV world theme. Then Persona 5 has a very strong heist thematic. Futaba the hacker, Haru the insider and funder, Ryoji the muscle, and so on. On top of that, P5's confidants give practical perks for the operations, much more so than the previous game's social links at least, which just further adds to the heist motif. As for Persona 3, well, much of what made this PS2 game so genius, at least to me, is its strong adherence to the Greek tragedian influence. And one of the three elements that Aristotle said is key to a Greek tragedy is hamartia of the hero, or in other words, a tragic flaw. And what do you know, Persona 3 consistently depicts this with not just the main cast's actions, but the social links as well. Nearly every conflict in a character's arc is due to said character's own hamartia. So, in other words, their pride, ego, or inability to empathize or understand, and so on. These things are what cause their downfall and or tragedy in the social link or story. Even the background lore that set off the chain reaction 10 years ago of Aigis, the protag, Ryoji, and Nyx all stem from the Kirijo group's arrogance. They believed they could control and manipulate the shadows to their own ends and ultimately mold the world as they saw fit. With all this said, I found it actually refreshing and also fitting how so many Persona 3 characters made a terrible impression as you're first getting to know them. A common complaint of the ensemble casts being that they're pretty unlikable, especially from the first few ranks of their social link. But I'd argue that that's the point. I loved seeing all these obnoxious or annoying kids mature and essentially grow up. I even did a whole little rant video a couple years ago on how awesome it is to see the human capacity to change portrayed in media, and I had to include Junpei and Yukari as major examples. Successful change is unfortunately not a given, and making it actually long-lasting can be so hard to accomplish in real life. But that's what makes it so satisfying and even inspiring, seeing characters break out of unhealthy habits, grow, and mature in our favorite stories. Reload, however, has definitely shaken things up here. PS2 FES on both an objective and meta discourse level is pretty well known for a variety of imperfections, which for better or for worse have been touched up on in this remake. Junpei and Yukari in particular undergoing the biggest evolution from their FES counterparts. Actually, the entire main cast in general has been touched up and made more generally sympathetic, which I think is especially apparent in the Guys Link episodes. More on each of these when I get to their respective character sections, but now let's finally transition into the dedicated section on Junpei. Persona 3 Reload really tones down Junpei's more jerk-ish attitude and also includes more moments of levity between him and the protag. You see, there's a tangible weight placed on his and MC's friendship this time around. Something that's not very explicit in FES and can only really be inferred if you paid close attention. I'll bring up receipts in just a minute, but first I just want to throw it out there that I think the devs noticed this relationship felt lacking compared to the depth of camaraderie you get with the bro characters of the later games, i.e. Yosuke in P4 and Ryoji in P5. Additionally, I think Reload Junpei was made to sound less bratty via his new voiceover.
Relax, I've got it covered. Him again? Relax, I've got it covered. Him again?
Some of his lines present as considerably less creepy, thankfully, and Zeno Robinson overall just perfectly captured the character's playful teen immaturity while also toning down the sheer arrogance of FES Junpei. In general, some brand new scenes in the main narrative have likely shifted the way Junpei is perceived by the average Reload player. For example, on only the second day of the game, Junpei introduces himself to the protag and says he'll show us around Polonia Mall, during which there's this new comedic scene where he tries to show us his mad crane game skills, and even drags the protagonist in, though their combined efforts are to no avail, unfortunately. In stark contrast, FES just has this moment where you can see MC and Junpei walking home together, with only a tiny text box saying, "You decided to go home with Junpei." That's it. It doesn't even specify if Junpei was the one who invited you to walk home with him or not, and overall it's just so passive. Meaning, Reload's new scene plays up his genuine friendliness, a la him taking actual initiative in inviting the protag to do some fun stuff at the mall. Now as for 420, here lies another major change to another walking home with Junpei scene. We hear him talk about apathy syndrome for the first time, like as in he reveals he's actually worried for the random people it's affecting, something which paints a more endearing picture of him as a decent guy at heart compared to his FES counterpart who, in the early months, sounded like he was only fighting shadows to stoke his own ego. But beyond just that, one of the most notable changes to me in Reload are the scripted first-time persona summoning fights for each party member, with Junpei and Yukari's first night in Tartarus being the standouts to me. Interestingly enough, for Junpei, the protag had to weaken the enemy first, before the former finishes it off. However, on that same night, Yukari takes out an entire enemy all by herself by launching a Garu first, then deals the finishing blow with her archery. By the way, I double-checked that this scene indeed plays out the exact same way in other people's footage. Which leads me to this point. Something interesting about the Ludo narrative changes in Reload when it comes to Junpei's early arc is how it basically replaced the early enemy's affinities, many of which were previously resistant to Junpei's attack types, so i.e. fire and slash. So on one hand, he feels much better to play in this remake, though most importantly, this change sells his insecurities in a different way than was done in FES. And what exactly do I mean by that? Well, Reload makes the protag the exact battle type as Junpei, so sword and fire a la his initial persona Orpheus. Remember, back in FES, the MC could use any of the weapon types, but since he can only use swords in Reload, this game sells Junpei's inferiority complex by having the protag be better at him at the only two things he's good at. Again, slash attacks and fire elementals. And get this, Junpei and the protag are the only two party members in Cs to share both weapon and elemental type. So a bit of a different take on how FES helped sell this character arc, though Reload still did it quite convincingly. Or well, you know, the more I think about it, the more I actually like it this way. But moving on to other changes, Junpei has some altered NPC lines in the dorms. After the infamous monorail incident, for example, in Reload, he tells the protag he was so glad he was there and how good it is to be alive. You know, like actual gratitude. Another significant altered dialogue moment is in July when he's apologizing to the protag. In Reload, he now deliberately says the word sorry. Meanwhile, in FES, he just sorta alludes to it, saying, I know I've been a dick lately, like, you can obviously understand the intention behind this, but the apology is still indirect, right? But now let's get into Junpei's Link episodes. These definitely portrayed him as a more likable and sympathetic character, bringing in his past background with baseball and how his feelings of inferiority have essentially always been a part of his life. Some ranks also inform us more on his natural tendency to want to help cheer people up when they're down, which was relegated mostly to just NPC dialogue before. For example, when he and Yukari hang out with Ken on many of the weekends leading up to his official debut at the C's dorms. It turns out Junpei is the one who approached Ken first all that time ago simply because he just thought the kid looked lonely. And so guess what? In his second Link episode, he buys a watermelon to break open, a Japanese summer tradition, just so Ken would have something to remember fondly from that past summer. On another note, so much of what the protag does for Junpei, like buying the flowers so he'll give them to Chidori, and just how the two hang out in the other Link episodes, are in large part what really sells the message this time that the two are bona fide bros in Reload. Like, there's no questioning that this time. Now, even though I've been really positive about all this new content so far, one thing that I do have some mixed feelings on is when Junpei apologizes in these Link episodes. The first time is quite early on in the game, just a few days after the second full moon boss, and what I kinda noticed is that when he takes responsibility for his previous mess-ups in these Links, it tends to make the moments where he does this in the main narrative feel pretty out of place. As in, I feel like with some of Junpei's Link episodes, there's this sort of trade-off. Like, sure, you get to see the close friendship with the protag get more steadily built throughout the game, but at the same time, it makes Junpei's apology after Chidori's death, for instance, feel unnecessary and kinda awkward because he already cleared the air with the main character earlier. This apology plays out the exact same way it does in FES, which is something the original game needed since there were no Link episodes. But for Reload, I guess these scenes are still there for the people who don't happen to do the new optional Junpei content, though if that's the case, I think a better way to go about it could have been slightly altering the main story's dialogue for players who already saw the relevant apologies via Link episodes. I want to make it clear though, I think these were all incredibly well done, and I particularly appreciate the fourth one, especially with how it directly connects what Junpei learned from Chidori. That the reason he was so scared about Nyx's arrival wasn't just because he doesn't want her sacrifice to be in vain, but also because he can finally understand on a personal level the kind of existential thoughts she grappled with knowing she would die soon. I have more to say about how this changed up a certain rooftop scene in January though. Trust me, it'll make sense when we get there. But anyway, I think it's cool that much like Fuuka, Junpei becomes a vital part of C's even if he doesn't necessarily have the biggest reason to be there at the start. Both these characters add a lot of heart to a group that's otherwise very reserved, which helps with the more emotional moments in later months. Both struggle with low self-esteem, albeit in different ways, but finally find their own purpose in life due to the experiences of the Dark Hour. But to start wrapping this section up, Reload really emphasized Junpei's class clown personality, the whole trying to bring the fun, the energy, and the cheer to the group. This was always the case even in the original FES, but Reload's added events like the study sessions just further characterized him as someone who employs comedy to lift people's spirits. Actually, all the second-year party members basically make up, quote, the heart of C's, in my opinion, including Yukari, and with that said, let's finally move on to her section now. So Yukari's compassion and care is the emphasis in this remake, especially seen via Reload's focus on her healing capabilities. Back in FES, this was always implicitly portrayed. that she does care a lot for everyone in C's, and that deep down she has this innate quality of reaching out to people and getting them to open up. The most social butterfly of C's many introverts. From checking to make sure Akihiko's okay during the very first full moon, to her vitriolic best friend dynamic with Junpei, her reassuring presence in Fuuka's social link, and so much more. She helps introduce Koromaru in his very first scene and always joins Junpei in hanging out with Ken at the shrine on the weekends prior to him actually joining C's. She's also the one to reach out to Mitsuru first during the whole Kyoto school trip arc, which ultimately leads to their inseparable friendship. So the point is, much like Junpei, she's one of the main connectors of C's. They're the most extroverted of the group and add a lot of energy to the team, something Shinji acknowledges when he comments on how different C's feels now that Yukari and Junpei have joined compared to when it was just him, Aki, and Mitsuru. So in other words, the dots always pointed to Yukari being a very caring people person, regardless of her outward demeanor. But many players unfortunately overlooked this and couldn't see past her abrasive first impressions. More on that in a sec, but first the new dorm activities. These further inform us of Yukari's warmth. You see, a big reason she likes cooking so much is seeing the smile on the protags, and in turn her friends' faces when they enjoy something she's made. She also mentions other friend groups outside of C's while watching movies, further pointing to her being a connector, akin to Junpei's numerous interactions with other guy NPCs in their class. Now, it is true that Yukari was much rougher around the edges in FES, in large part thanks to Michelle Ruff's performance. Get it? Rough and rough? Okay, back to the actual point. Yukari's lines had a harsher and or hostile tone, certainly, but God forbid a woman be remotely prone or quick to anger without being called a bitch. She had so much on her plate, seemingly the only one trying to figure out the truth behind the accident that killed not just her father but multiple people, the estranged relationship with her mother, the hate the both of them received post-disaster due to her father's position. Like, no wonder she has such simmering frustration just waiting to boil over, along with an initial difficulty in trusting people's intentions. Those aren't excuses, of course, just simply explanations for her behavior, and Yukari herself always took responsibility and apologized. Though, interestingly enough, the English PS2 voice direction seemed to be more of a localization decision, I believe. Her portrayal in Japanese was always much sweeter and kinder from what I understand. Like, if I could describe Yukari's demeanor in ultra stereotypical high school movie terms, P3 FES English was the more popular preppy girl vibe, while Reload Yukari is more the sweet girl next door. Though to be fair, she's an incredibly nuanced character in both her iterations and ends up subverting popular traits of both those archetypes. You know, she's not all mean in FES, but she's also not all nice in Reload. And I think the second full moon scenario encompasses the difference pretty well. She's clearly worried about Junpei going off on his own, but notice how she doesn't call him Stupe in Reload compared to FES. Her heart-to-heart convo with the protag at Yakushima was also tweaked, now sounding significantly less abrasive. Again, as I mentioned in the preface to Junpei and Yukari's character sections, on one hand, I am personally kinda bummed with this change, so I can definitely understand why a number of OG P3 players feel like the Yukari detractors won! No! Now that her more scathing remarks have been toned down. Yeah, cause a part of me liked how she essentially broke typical gender roles, especially for back then. She wouldn't hold back, or in other words, keep the peace, just because that's the more expected thing out of women. You know, just smile, nod along, and bite your tongue. When it comes to my family, I can definitely relate. Like, Yukari certainly had the right to know what happened with the Kirijo group and the origins of Tartarus, which is only revealed thanks to her continuously pressing Mitsuru for the info. And awkward transition, but I feel like Yukari's role in Fuuka's social link, even if it wasn't on screen in FES, was always underrated. So it's nice to see the new reload activities reinforce their friendship, and like, actually if we look across all the link episodes / social links in this game, Yukari has the most varied number of cameos out of any party member. Which leads me to this next point. One of the most heartwarming evolutions in Reload, at least for me, was the additional focus placed on the protag Junpei and Yukari as a trio. I mean, the first couple months are just the three of them on the ground, given Aki's injury and Mitsuru playing navigator. C's could not have gotten far without the trio's teamwork early on. Sure, this is the same case in FES, but the protag's relationship with Yukari and Junpei as separate individuals, as well as the two's friendship with the other, just feels more tangible with the dorm activities and stuff in Reload. In general, he's depicted as more sociable now with his first friends at Tatsumi Port Island compared to his explicit solitude in FES. Another contrast in Reload I couldn't help but pick up on were the altered interactions at the school gates, one instance being on April 18th. Original FES only has Yukari greeting MC, but Reload has Junpei come up first, with Yukari joining them shortly after. It just makes the dynamic feel more natural over the course of the game, that they seek each other out of their own accord. Again, just selling the trio as genuine friends. This vibe culminates in a certain rooftop moment on January 8th. In a scene that was delegated only to Junpei in FES, now all three of them take a moment to reminisce over the year they've spent together. The dialogue is just so heartfelt, and I love how they rib on each other throughout despite the heavy topics like the worsening apathy syndrome in town. Just the fact that they can laugh at their immature mistakes from earlier in the year and know that each other's teasing isn't mean-spirited in any way is just goals, guys. This scene is truly wholesome and is low-key actually one of my favorite new moments in this remake. Now, I'd like to take a moment to thank all my patrons and channel members. Your support has been a huge help during this entire first half of 2024 as I've struggled with this ongoing transverse myelitis flare-up. So I truly thank you for your patience and for your financial support, which does help in tiding me over between uploads. I post much more in-depth updates and early access to parts of videos if you'd also like to join. Ultimately though, even just watching, liking, commenting, and sharing my videos do so much for me and my channel, and I'm always beyond grateful for all of you. And now back to the video. But speaking of major evolutions, boy did Reload do a lot for Ken. Aside from making his kit feel so much better to play, his characterization has been significantly improved. Like, maybe this is just me, but I always felt like he could never step out of the shadow of more popular characters, Akihiko, Mitsuru, and Shinji, all of whom are tied to his character arc. A real shame, since it feels like the underlying tragedy and sadness of his situation goes overlooked as a result. You see, his maturity despite his young age was always mentioned in FES, though we never got a great picture of what that actually entails. However, I view something as mundane as the new coffee brewing activity as a major step forward in crafting this aspect of Ken's character, that he has to be a pragmatic person, always trying to improve or learn new practical things, or essentially problem-solve the obstacles in his life, all in a way that's more characteristic of when a person is older, and not what is normally expected from a child. Friendly reminder, he's legit still in elementary school, guys. Additionally, in his Link episodes, he's always training, with this underlying mindset that it's better to do this than relax and be unproductive, right? It's just heartbreaking to witness a kid forced to grow up quickly because they don't have the luxury of parents looking out for them. Something that actually gives us plenty of insight into the other C's characters as well, since so many of them had to grow up just like Ken, considering the sheer amount of absent or deceased parents among the cast. Admittedly, I'm biased towards Ken's plight for personal reasons too, since I can relate to that feeling of having to grow up quickly. You see, for much of my adolescence, my mom was chronically ill, the last few years of her life in which she was completely bedridden, so it was mostly up to me to take over the necessary household chores/errands after school. And on top of that, having to learn how to be a caregiver in her final stage of life. So yeah, I have a lot of empathy for Ken. But beyond just that, his first 2 Link episodes also do a great job showing how devastating it can be to plan your entire life around one singular goal. By the way, I need to throw out a trigger warning since I'm gonna be talking about S-word ideation and thoughts of unaliving oneself for the rest of the section, and gotta love censoring this video to avoid being demonetized again. So, Ken displays a lot of the general warning signs. In Link number 1, he doesn't allow himself to think dinner was yummy or good. Why? Well, hindsight tells us it's because he's preparing to off himself after he completes his vengeance. So in the lead up to that, Ken thinks he can't afford to become attached or like anything in life. Then when a classmate from school expresses his hopes that Ken returns to soccer practice, what's the latter's response? That he's decided not to make any promises since C's will be going through a lot. Overall, just skirting around the underlying truth that, in reality, he's only hanging on until he gets to kill Shinji. Then, in the second Link episode, Ken's now moved on to making legitimate plans for when he's gone. Like, he actually says if something happens to him, he wants the protag to take care of his guinea pig, and have all the stuff in his room too, why not? I.e. giving his possessions away. Like, dude, who would say all of this unless they're already planning on being gone? The exploration of heavy topics like these is where I believe Reload truly succeeds in expanding Ken's narrative. It becomes clear how much C's means to him, to the point where he's discovered other things in life to keep living for. A particular moment in Reload that stood out to me is when Ken asks why is everyone so kind to him. They're not like the other adults who pity him, nor the kids his age that don't understand him. Instead, C's just treats him like a normal person. Well, he's most likely referring to the second years in particular here, which brings me to this sort of tangent. Part of the reason I wanted to cover Fuuka, Junpei, and Yukari sections before Ken's is because of their underrated involvement in his character arc. You see, the second years are the ones consistently talking and hanging out with Ken in optional overworld dialogue, events, and so on. They also speak to each other about Ken's well-being, but not in a pitying way, but in a way that you'd extend to your actual friend. So, in the end, it's Ken's third Link episode that really nails home the takeaway that was otherwise only implied back in FES. He's actually making an effort now to simply enjoy spending time and having fun with his old friends at school, and with his newfound friends in C's. Simply reading manga, playing video games, and enjoying snacks. All the mundane things he didn't allow himself to do back when his only goal in life was just to avenge his mom. This is what tangibly demonstrates Ken's answer to Shinji's final words for him, to make his life his own, and live for himself. Okay, something related to Ken that did bother me occurred in his Persona's transformation scene. I just really miss the animation of him pounding on the wall, and I'm not entirely sure why I liked it so much. I guess it's just because it adds some nice tension to the monologue. And since we're on this topic, there are other unique animations that I thought really sold their respective scenes in PS2 era P3 that sadly didn't make it into Reload. There's Akihiko lifting the evoker to his head when he asks the newbies if they truly have the resolve to fight, Junpei shaking hands with the protag after apologizing post Chidori's death, Aigis collapsing to the ground, and Fuuka kneeling down to comfort her in December, just to name a few. And one scene in Reload that I felt was particularly awkward was when Junpei blew up at the MC after learning the truth about Nyx. It was pretty uncanny seeing no real visual changes in the expression and animation, which was especially jarring given how well Zeno Robinson sold Junpei's panic and frustration here. Like, there really is something to be said about updated graphics having this kind of uncanny valley effect when realistic movement doesn't accompany it. Maybe some additional mocap would have helped, though I totally understand that's asking a whole lot out of the development process and schedule. So anyway, overall, I do think the animations in Reload are pretty charming. I especially liked everyone celebrating and having fun after defeating the final full moon boss, i.e. the updated photo-taking scene. But I also just wanted to point out this particular gripe I had with certain animations, or lack thereof, in some important moments. Now, moving on to Shinji, I enjoyed the additional look into the OG Dream Team, courtesy of his Link episodes. The old promise Mitsuru, Shinji, and Aki made to graduate together does add another layer of tragedy to Shinji's untimely death. Though I'm also of the mind that this addition wasn't exactly necessary, since his death is plenty tragic enough on its own, given how he's still only a senior in high school, and that he ultimately did this to himself. You see, Reload emphasized the self-sabotage and unaliving component of his persona suppression pills arc much more, since while the necessary lore scenes were in FES, Reload elaborated on it with additional scenes, as well as within the actual gameplay. It's always been a headcanon and wish of mine that if there were ever a P3 remake, that Strega would lean more into the glass cannon status, given how their personas can go berserk a la Chidori in the hospital. Like, it'd be really fitting if they had the ability to buff themselves significantly via drawing from their own health pool, aka a berserker class. Which is pretty much what Shinji's kit is with Bloody Charge, and Jin is capable of a similar thing in his final boss fight. More on Strega later in their own section. But overall, I think it's actually Shinji's dorm activities that are the real stars of his new content. More so than his Link episodes, in my opinion. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm definitely not complaining about the additional interaction, both direct and indirect, between him, Akihiko, and Mitsuru. I like how it honestly highlights how people who love each other can still have such trouble communicating. But the cooking and gardening activities are where it's at, further expanding on Shinji's true nature deep down and further solidifying him as the Hierophant Arcana in the main narrative. And by the way, if you're confused about him being categorized as this Arcana, I recommend watching my Persona 3 and the Fool's Journey analysis video sometime. You see, even though the male party members and Strega had no actual social links with the MC, their roles in the main story all filled one of the first 13 Arcana, ending thematically with death, with Shinji being the Hierophant thanks to Castor's categorization. And so, these new dorm activities show how he's the one who's the mentor/teacher to the protag, and an incredibly skilled one at that. An interesting dynamic considering how normally the MC is the one that's more skilled than whoever he's hanging out with. I also don't mean to tie a person's worth with their productivity, but I do think there's an added layer of tragedy to Shinji's death considering how capable and skilled he was at these things. Makes you wonder what he would have been doing in the future like the rest of the P3 cast in the arena games. Farm to table pro cook Shinji, anyone? I think it's also worth highlighting that he's the only guy of the main cast to do the two most traditionally nurturing options of all the dorm stuff: cooking and tending to the plants/crops, which in turn makes it so he's technically tending to his fellow teammates as well via growing/making things for them. It just further builds upon the complexity Portable Social Link elaborated on, that Shinji is more of a softie than his gruff, standoffish demeanor suggests, though ultimately I think he's one of the characters whose overall portrayal hasn't changed much across all the iterations of P3. Even way back in FES, we already had the secret recording of Shinji watching cooking shows and making food for Koro to allude to these hidden depths. Reload just takes it up a notch, which interestingly enough plays into Akihiko's evolution in this game. So aside from Junpei and Yukari, Akihiko is the party member that felt the most different or the most evolved from his FES iteration. Like Yukari, there are more instances of him explicitly showing his care for the others. With that in mind, I do think the original voiceover and dialogue show his obsession with power better. There's just something about Liam O'Brien's performance that sells the kinda selfish, honestly, tunnel-visioned Aki better. I'll clarify what I mean by selfish in a minute, but first I have to say I don't think the shift in voice direction is bad or anything, because I also see Reload Akihiko as just a different character, much like Junpei and Yukari, where the devs just chose to emphasize a different part of them this time. In Aki's case, it's the team dad role to better coincide with Mitsuru's team mom position. Well, actually, in proper TV tropes terms, Aki's scenes dip more into the father to his men vibe in this remake. And you may be asking right now, where am I even pulling these archetypes for these two from? Well, Akihiko's persona is of the Emperor Arcana, with Mitsuru's being of the Empress, both representing the archetypal fatherly and motherly role respectively in the Fool's Journey. Again, I recommend my P3 and the main cast Arcana explained video if you'd like to learn more. But sure, the deeper pitch for Reload Akihiko took getting used to and even felt off in the first couple months, likely because it just makes him sound older, right? But come his second and third Link episodes, and the new voice direction actually made a lot more sense to me. You see, I find Alejandro Saab's performance for Aki ends up sounding more gentle and warm, for lack of a better description, which perfectly coincides with Aki's expanded characterization in this remake. In contrast, I feel like O'Brien's performance never truly loses that intimidating edge, even after the character kinda mellows out post Shinji's death. Meaning, overall, I find it hard to picture FES Akihiko doing and saying some of the stuff later down the line. For instance, in Reload, Akihiko asks Ken, "Is this where you want to be?" in this very important December scene, instead of, "Is this where you should be?" in FES. The changing of one word might seem simple, but is still significant since want implies he's thinking more about Ken's side of things instead of the more commanding should. Another example that highlights this difference particularly well takes place during the third full moon operation. In FES, Aki wastes no time complimenting Junpei for getting them into the school grounds. He just completely moves on. Like, in general, FES Aki was always in go 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 mode. But in Reload, he actually joins Mitsuru in giving praise where praise is due, and I see this as him actually showing more inclination and discernment towards building team morale. With that said, I'm gonna make the case that he comes across as more of a team player and much earlier at that in Reload. You see, this team dad kind of vibe was really only reserved for Ken in FES, but this extends to all of C's in the remake. For example, in his second Link episode, Akihiko shares the goodies his foster parents sent him with the entire team, and shows inklings that it was nice making everyone so happy. Most significantly, though, is what he asks the protag after. He clearly has something he doesn't as a leader, so what is it that makes him so successful as one? Now, no matter what response you choose, the implication is that the protag invests in the bonds he has with other people, something you don't see much of in FES Aki. The third Link episode continues to build on this, plus it also informs us on what Akihiko's learned from Shinji beyond just looking out for Ken. So earlier, I covered how Shinji is actually really nurturing deep down, right? He's patient with teaching the protag cooking skills, and he allows the plants to take their time growing, yeah? If you contrast Akihiko's activities, especially his cooking style, he's one to prioritize efficiency and not necessarily the taste or other factors that would make someone eating it think, wow, this is more than just nourishment, this is really good. That kind of thing, yeah? That was more Shinji's thing. But then we get to Aki's third Link episode, right after Shinji dies. Aki makes pancakes for everyone in Seas in an attempt to cheer them up, entrusting someone else, the protag, to help him with it too. And the pancakes actually taste normal, not that protein shit, as Shinji would say, and is more about the feelings of happiness it would bring to people. Just adding on to that team morale aspect of his new characterization. It's this kind of story event that's hard for me to imagine O'Brien's Aki doing. Or to explain a step further, it's the things that appear less typically masculine, call it societal gender roles, and are more nurturing instead. Like, while FES Akihiko wasn't as overtly self-serving to the extent Junpei was, he was still less concerned and or considerate of other people if they didn't serve his very narrow goal of getting stronger. Meanwhile, I find it pretty telling that Reload explicitly shows Akihiko being troubled over what Yukari said about him and his fighting obsession. The culmination of this evolution is in his fourth Link episode, where those punks threaten the girls and even the little boy and dog back at the dorm. Akihiko realizes that not only does he have people, aka all of Seas, who he wants to protect, but also understands now that he has people, a team, who he wants fighting alongside him. That second part is something that's never really elaborated on in FES, given the persistently solitary Aki. But to kinda wrap this up, I find Sob manages to capture that same clueless dorkiness when it comes to relational things involving others, yet also adds this layer of emotional vulnerability that just wasn't prominent in FES, except for that one scene. You know, the persona evolution at Shinji's memorial. As I've already talked about in this video before, this is basically going to boil down to our individual preference for this character's portrayal. I can definitely understand why people may like FES Akihiko more, since I genuinely feel like he gives off a different demeanor in both games. But for me, I personally really enjoyed seeing this new take on the same old character we know and love. Again, a different performance/direction doesn't invalidate the existing one. Moving on to Mitsuru, she was already amazing in FES and is even more fantastic in Reload. Though, to be clear, I find she's one of the characters that feels the least different in overall demeanor across the Persona 3 games. There just aren't any significant changes to her main dialogue in this remake, though some of the optional content does build on some of her existing traits, mainly her sentimentality and deep regard for the things of the past. You see, FES Mitsuru has this tendency to reminisce, as well as just overall possess a great memory, with her being the one who usually recounts, or in other words, explains, the events of the past for the other Seas members, and for us the player. So like Kirijo's involvement in creating Tartarus, the truth of what happened to Ken's mom, and so on. Then in her social link, she gets pretty sentimental over the good times and fond memories she's associated with her motorbike. With that said, one of the most significant ways Reload builds on this aspect of her character is actually in Shinji's new Link episodes. The promise the original C's trio made to graduate high school together clearly means a lot to her, and she wistfully recalls those good old days during part of his third Link. This old picture of the trio together is dear to her heart, and she's incredibly touched when Protag posthumously finds Shinji's signature on the school re-enrollment form. On a related note, it's nice to see how much she understands Akihiko and that she decides not to tell him about this until everything is over, since that's just the kind of person he is. Which leads me to this point. I find it fascinating how she's so actively invested in the past, something that further contrasts with Aki, who is consistently striving to move on from the past, for better or for worse. I noticed that Akihiko usually needs to be reminded by some external force about his past, like his parents sending him the care package and Miki's medal, Shinji's actual death, and so on. Like, okay, I get that technically nearly all the Persona 3 cast is preoccupied on some level with a part of their past, so Aki and his sister's death, Yukari and her dad, Ken and his mom, Mitsuru herself with the Kirijo legacy and wanting to protect her father, but not everyone is characterized by the kind of sentimentality that Mitsuru demonstrates throughout the game. And it's actually her new dorm activities that showcase how she low-key seeks out these things of her own accord. Her reading activity dives into her great respect for history and the lessons that can be parsed from knowing it. She takes inspiration from the great figures of yore in both their victories as well as their hardships. Then in her cooking activity, she chooses a sentimental dish, something associated with fond memories of her childhood. She sounds so wistful here, just like when she talks about her motorbike, and God do I relate to her sentimentality. I tend to be pretty minimalist when it comes to possessions, but there's something about all the sentimental clothing, gifts, and so on that I associate with specific people and or memories that I just can't bring myself to get rid of. I guess I've always just appreciated Mitsuru's appreciation for things, which brings me to how I've always loved her for the sheer childlike joy or wonder she'd show for the most mundane things and new experiences. Like, people joke about the burger, but seriously, you'd think a burger is beautiful too if it was your first time trying one. So yeah, I love all the girls in Persona 3, but Mitsuru? She's my girly. Something else I want to point out is the sheer weight of responsibility Mitsuru has to contend with and how Reload builds on that with the added Shinji stuff. Like how a part of her blames herself for getting him involved with C's. FES already established how she felt responsible for her own father's demise thanks to Ikutsuki's betrayal, as well as just the heavy Kirijo legacy in general. And this is all on top of her being the leader of C's, so making sure everything is functioning, calling the shots, still leading by example, and so on. Before the protag arrived and helped share the burden of responsibility. So while my experience is nothing as dire as Mitsuru's, I always couldn't help but empathize with her situation. I rarely, if ever, mention on this channel that I was responsible for many leadership positions prior to my chronic illness. To name a few, I was a representative at large in student government and planned and hosted large events people wanted to see, section leader of a large trombone section, and established a branch of an outside aid organization on campus. So I get having responsibility for not just the functioning of all the activities themselves, but also building connections with everyone and fostering team unity. One major thing being, while you don't want to force people to constantly interact, because everyone's tolerance, wants, and needs for that are different, you also don't want anyone to feel outright left out or excluded. With that said, I like how Reload alters the reason for Aigis joining everyone as a student. Here, it's specified that Mitsuru herself thought of bringing Aigis' request to the chairman, while that wasn't the case in FES. And though Mitsuru herself may not be the most natural people person, I too am not the best. She shows she wants the best for everyone under her care. Some of the additional reload texts and study sessions build on this, like her asking Protag to check up on Ken in her place. Understandable given her background. But overall, Mitsuru in this remake hasn't evolved to the extent of some other characters already covered, though actually there is one significant change to her dialogue on the promise day, something that really bothered me, not gonna lie. And it's what she says to Takaya before our final fight. So with that, let's transition over to Strega. I found it kinda strange that C's had such a hard time leaving Jin behind after defeating him in Tartarus. In FES, Mitsuru just looks down briefly before being the first one to press forward, and everyone else follows shortly after. And while that still does eventually happen in Reload, there's a huge change that legit took me out of the team's supposed resolve for a moment. Like, why is this dialogue option even presented? Did you really just make me actually question if C's knows what's at stake here, even though they've just spent the entirety of the past month talking about it in the dorms? Plus, the scene was made even more narmy and awkward thanks to Jin not appearing truly beat to the point where he's just a lame duck. You're telling me he collapses straight on his ass in FES? Like he's that banged up? But then in Reload, he's just casually still standing there? And we don't even see him chuck the bomb on the ground? Like, just another example of Reload's lack of certain dynamic animations that I mentioned earlier. And to relate this back to Mitsuru, I was especially miffed at what she said to Takaya. She basically gives a power of friendship / bond speech, and I get that it fits the overall tonal shift of Reload more, but damn do I miss the OG FES response. No one person has the right to determine if we all live or die. And you guys know me and the kind of videos I do, I'm normally a sucker for the power of friendship. So, as it turns out, Strega is probably the group of characters I have the most mixed feelings on when it comes to Reload. Chidori I'll return to later since I first want to wrap up the thoughts on Takaya and Jin. So I kinda prefer their FES iterations, NGL. I think these two benefit from less is more and having a layer of mystery or obscurity to them. I had this whole section written out on why I find them such a fascinating duo in the wider scheme of modern Persona, but it was getting way too long and was besides the point of this video, so I'm saving my entire meta-analysis on Takaya and Jin for a hot takes video. But I guess long story short, since we see so little of both of them in FES, we could never know for sure what kind of dynamic they actually had, though all pointers were to it being really unhealthy cult-like, which, oddly enough, played a big part in what made them interesting to me. It just left room for speculation, and you could probably tell how much I like that based on some of my videos, and they both just never developed an understanding of what healthy interaction and sense of self is because of the trauma incurred from surviving the Kirijo child experiments. I.e., they just don't know what being normal friends is like, and that's an overlooked tragedy to me. Though, interestingly enough, Reload did make it seem like Takaya somewhat cared about Jin more than what FES ever let on, and in a way that goes beyond just finding him useful, I guess. The emotional attachment always seemed one-sided on Jin's end, but in this remake they added something that was first seen in the P3 movies. Takaya, now the only surviving member of Strega, explicitly says he wishes Jin was there with him to see the end as Nyx finally descends. But as for the other added Takaya scenes, the only one I truly liked was at the Moonlight Bridge. Scripted boss fight or not, I appreciate any attempt to portray Strega as an actual threat this time around compared to the easy peasy bosses they were in FES. Seeing Takaya finish off the Abaddon one of the highest level enemies in all of P3, gets the job done in my book. Otherwise, I don't think any of these other Takaya and MC only scenes were entirely necessary. Sure, they further clarify the motivations and lore, like it wasn't until we fight Jin for the last time that we hear anything about the Kirijo experiments, and in Reload that's now mentioned way earlier. But still, all that info was contained in the main narrative already, and I miss the more unconventional chronology when it came to lore reveals, not gonna lie. So it seems they were trying to build up a feeling of jealousy from Takaya over the protagonist's chosen one powers, like a certain P5 royal character. But I just don't think it really works for Takaya. Someone who has always seemed quite assured of himself and who doesn't hide behind a fake facade. At least that's how I've always interpreted him. So this tiny subplot just didn't seem very worthwhile to me, nor did it feel like it fit the role Takaya's meant to have in the story anyway. You probably know what I'm gonna say next at this point. I highly suggest my P3 and Arcana analysis if you want to understand how exactly Takaya's role as the Fortune worked in the OG narrative. But okay, so actually, this is where the mixed feelings come in again, because while I'm not a huge fan of some of the new main story scenes, I did enjoy how the sheer number of new overworld NPCs meant more tidbits on how every individual Strega member is just living their life. I like the darkly humorous comments about Jin in particular. For instance, the guy outside the arcade finally gets the courage to ask the guy with the sunglasses about the ball he keeps tossing in his hand. Of course he gets no response, but dude, let's just say that's not a Pokeball. And then another guy assumes since the Four Eyes seems like the most normal of the three, there can't be anything dangerous in his suitcase, right?
Bruh.
Lol, this bro has no sense of self-preservation. So yeah, I thought these new NPC comments added quite a bit of fun to Strega's characterization. Also, it's such a relief that their boss fights aren't a complete joke this time around. I mentioned in Shinji's section already that Jin's sacrificial HP mechanic was really cool for ludonarrative reasons, and Takaya getting Thurgy, a fear-inducing and full SP drain one at that, was a fitting way to make him appear more dangerous as well. Though what was really cool was seeing them use Shift in the tag team fight. Not that I'd know what that's like. Thanks again, Reload Tactics, for never ever using Shift. It's just rare to fight more than one antagonist at a time in the Persona games, so we only get to see bosses with team mechanics like this once in a blue moon. Or maybe I should say more like yellowish green moon? Hey, don't look at me like that. Okay, one final note on the new Strega scenes. I thought the ones with Takaya and Jin were fine, but that's also because those ones usually contained wider Persona series lore too. I can't help but think this was deliberately intended to explicitly begin tying the entire franchise together more. Maybe? Take the "I am the shadow, the true self" line from Takaya. This references a core thematic of Persona 4, right? And given the leaks that certain other Persona games are also receiving the remake treatment, and, well... Now, as we transition into Chidori's section, I first have to ask, did anyone else notice that Reload basically pushes Jin as the emotional glue holding Strega together? He's the one who actually sounds worried about her after she's captured. He's the one mentioning the memories they have as Strega, and fun fact, but he actually speaks to her this time around as they break her out of the hospital. Most of you probably don't remember this, but he straight up didn't say a single word the entire scene back in FES. It was all just Takaya's manipulation. Anyway, the point I'm actually getting at here is that it's nice to see the remake try to address the original's odd lack of, or more like non-existent, concern over Chidori from the only other two in the group. On a somewhat related note, I'm just glad to see the characters acknowledge her abilities more this time around, and thank you, Reload, for giving her the power boost she deserved! First off, on a lore level, since Fuuka's abilities are more varied and powerful than they ever were in FES, a la her Theurgy and new Tartarus abilities, Chidori's own power is elevated as a result. Like, I can actually buy that a proper showdown between navigators is taking place in narrative moments, like when Fuuka legit cannot sense Strega's presence at all, or even that time when Medea completely hijacked Lucia so Chidori could talk to Cease directly. And speaking of her boss fight, thank goodness it's actually tough this time. It always felt like she was the most memed on out of all the trio's fights, given how she could be taken down in just 1 or 2 hits. So the sheer damage done by her first attack in Reload was completely unexpected in the most incredible way though. So considering how conflicted she is over her feelings for Junpei, Reload's fight actually telegraphs her pain, her rage, her emotion via the punishing nature of it. With that said, her VA did such a fantastic job selling Chidori's panic and fear in this final confrontation. And in general, I think both characters' new voiceovers helped elevate the pair's chemistry. Plus, some altered dialogue helps these first encounters feel more natural/organic as well. For example, in the first meeting, Junpei doesn't just brush off her art like he does in FES. Instead, in Reload, he actually seems curious about Chidori's art in and of itself, which I think helps the following visits from him feel less stalkery and contrived/disingenuous. So this may be a hot take, but it was kinda hard for me to buy Chidori's interest in him early on in FES. Meanwhile, the increased emotional inflection in Reload's voiceover really helped in this regard. The full moon scenario where Chidori captures Junpei particularly stood out to me. I like that it leaned more into sadness than anger when it comes to the feeling of betrayal, though to be clear, anger is definitely an emotion present here too. But back to the sadness, this goes for both of them, by the way. For Chidori, it's the disappointment that he lied to her. Meanwhile, for Junpei, given how he's always been one to react with anger first when frustrated in other main story scenes, I see this new sadness take in Reload as additional evidence that Chidori just brings out another side of him and vice versa. Now, to be clear, I don't think the FES voices are bad per se. I think they were great in their own way, with Junpei's being a classic, but it's Reload's interpretation of Chidori that's more convincing to me. She always sounded older than her actual age in the OG, so I appreciate the remake trying to capture how young she still is. Like, seriously, she's just a teenage girl. Something that only further sells the tragedy of her condition and this young love story. She also sounds less like a caricature.
That's why this is how it should be. You can't die here, Junpei.
That's why this is for the best. You can't die here, Junpei.
Which I think only endears us to her character and helps her stand as more than just Junpei's love interest. Though, to be fair, I never saw her as only that, but I'm aware of the not uncommon sentiment that she always felt more like a mere catalyst for Junpei's growth. Which, you know, I can see where this take is coming from. Arguably, she still kinda is, though I think Reload has been a clear improvement. I really like what the whole flower subplot in Junpei's third Link episode adds in particular, cause on one hand it lets Protag play wingman for his bro, which just further builds up their best bud relationship. But more importantly, it paints a pretty cool full circle narrative for Chidori, Junpei, and what they do for the other. Junpei buys the flowers, Chidori brings them and him back to life, then she herself is revived by those same flowers. Okay, so I gotta admit, a number of my favorite pairs in fiction have a pretty significant pay each other back or like come full circle element to the relationship, especially if it's the flavor of, oh, you saved my life once, now I'm returning the favor, may or may not be in a sacrificial way. Oh man, I think I just revealed I'm a sucker for tragic ships. Well, at least Chidori survives, even though, yeah, that memory wipe hurts so good. But to start wrapping the section up, to be completely honest, I never thought much about this pairing back in FES. I always liked Junpei's arc more for tackling inferiority complex and self-esteem issues in relation to the protag and C's. That's also due to my IRL circumstances of the time, though I definitely recognized how much of an impact Chidori had on him. It's just, the romance itself always felt lukewarm to me. But I was definitely more convinced thanks to Reload's alterations. Everything about that final confrontation was perfect. From the battle itself to Chidori's monologue when saving Junpei to the beautiful in-engine cutscene and heart-wrenching voiceover. Seriously 10 out of 10. Well done Persona 3 Reload for selling me on their relationship. And now for a brief section on Koromaru. Reload may not have altered anything really, but it did build on his already existing traits from FES, starting with his super wholesome Link episodes. From the priest's old friend to the nice lady and even the little kids, everyone's presence here shows just how much of a beloved figure Koro is in town, and explicitly confirms everything about him being the guardian watchdog. A reputation that was mostly contained to just subtext back in FES, and which matched up fittingly with his persona's mythological inspiration, an analysis you can check out in this video. Something I especially loved seeing confirmation for though happens in January. Aigis mentions that Koro-chan was the only one in C's capable of using 2 theurgies right from the start because he already crossed a major milestone. Or in other words, he already achieved a healthy mentality, reflecting how he begins narratively as the upright version of his arcana already, unlike the rest of the party. Sorry for bringing it up yet again, but seriously go check out my P3 Arcana analysis. Lastly, I appreciate the extra world building Koro's Link 4 provides. The whole pets struggling to survive and fend for themselves when their owners fall victim to apathy syndrome thing. It draws attention to a very realistic consequence that's just never brought up in OG FES, yet only adds to the direness and urgency of resolving P3's plot. But that about covers Koro, so now let's move on to Aigis. Sorry, but I need to get this off my chest first. I freaking died laughing at Aigis' Naruto run in Yakushima. I was just not expecting it. Even though I guess I should have known better given how she runs in FES. I think it's just because it's so slow in this scene, plus combine that with the flowiness of her dress and yeah. Hopefully it's not just me that found this so stupid. But moving on to the more serious analysis, what I found quite fascinating is how Reload chose to evolve Aigis' nature as a machine. People's expectations of AI as well as its actual capabilities have come a long way since 2006/7 when Persona 3 and P3 FES were first released, right? We're used to hearing pretty human-sounding AI/digital vocalizations at this point in the year 2024. Siri and Alexa have become pop culture mainstays throughout this decade, and at the time of me recording this, OpenAI has just revealed ChatGPT 4o's voice, and it's honestly pretty scary how human the cadence and inflections sound.
Rocky, that's quite a statement piece. I mean, you'll definitely stand out. Though maybe not in the way you're hoping for an interview.
Okay, I got it.
Hey Chad, are you there?
The questionable, allegedly unethical way this voice was developed is a whole separate topic, which we're not getting into here. But with all this in mind, it makes tons of sense to me why P3 Reload moved on from the obviously robotic voice direction of PS2 era Aigis, since it's just dated now. Instead, Aigis sounds pretty indistinguishable from humans in P3 Reload, meaning her machine nature needs to be depicted in a different way, this time highlighting other traits like gathering precise information, prioritizing analysis, drawing from her endless databases, and of course, usually choosing the most logical/efficient option. I like this little dorm convo in October where Aigis creates the perfect training regimen tailored to Akihiko via her machine analysis. And then there's her sheer fascination with everything pertaining to humans or just life in general, but in a way that clearly sounds more removed than an actual human who inherently knows they're part of life on Earth, right? Her entire gardening activity is her learning from this tiny ecosystem consisting of the plants, the ladybugs, and even the pests. The takeaway being that every living thing is just doing the best they can to make it in the world. A concept that builds on Aigis' already existing arc in FES in the final months of the game, where she has learned to empathize and understand the perspective of the humans who are drawn to the cult of Nyx, even if she herself ultimately disagrees and must take a stance against it. I have a bit more to say on this in Ryoji's section too, actually, but to sum up my overall thoughts on Aigis' new voiceover, I've been really impressed with Dawn M. Bennett. She definitely nailed the much-needed update to Aigis' voice given just how far our expectations have come regarding machine vocalizations. But since there is less noticeable contrast now to distinguish Aigis from the rest of the party via voice alone, I think it's pretty ingenuous of Reload to alter her dialogue instead. By that, I'm mostly referring to Aigis' attempts to learn and use human slang/turns of phrase, which wasn't really a thing in the PS2 games. This addition is more noticeable in her optional content, like the new dorm activities. Like in the first rank of the reading one, she asks what "that ass better not crack under pressure" actually means, and ends the link with "we should head to our rooms," or should I say, our turfs. Another update I love in particular is what she has to say after the October exams when describing her failure. Aigis says, as Junpei would say, "I will be in deep shit." So overall, she slowly becomes more natural at these things as Reload progresses, like in the final reading activity where she just straight up says, "I feel like going to Tartarus and raising some hell!" Like, notice there's no reference or clarification like she'd normally add in earlier instances. As for her scenes in the main narrative, they are now more explicit with her transition from machine to human. Take, for instance, her persona evolution scene. Mitsuru's dialogue in FES was, "You've changed so much already, you're changing as we speak." Meanwhile, in Reload, it's, "You've even started speaking like a real human." Aigis' response to Takaya on the final day takes a page from Persona 3 Portable's script, a change that truly highlights how human she's become since it shows her speaking from an individualized place. And we all know that a fundamental part of the human condition is our inherent individuality, the ability for all of us to form our own thoughts, wants, and goals. Aigis speaks with only I statements in Reload's take on the scene. The whole, "but personally, I wouldn't want to live that way. I want a purpose and to have others I care about," and so on. This is in stark contrast to FES, where she says, "Now we know it was a mistake, and it's a matter of believing in ourselves." Notice no I's, so never referring to just herself, as well as no expansion on what she herself actually wants, like she says in Reload. Like, sure, back in FES she's clear about it in scenes where it's just her and the protag, but speaking of those moments, I'd argue that Aigis benefits the most from the new Platonic social link option out of all the girl party members. her role in the main narrative has always been so reliant on just the protag, so I really love the final Platonic rank where the other second years join in on the scene. Of course, it starts with Aigis asking the MC to take a selfie with her, though this is a significant request in and of itself. You see, there's nothing inherently special about the location, nor timing, nor occasion for this. Neither is it significant in any technical photography sense, but it is a captured memory of a loved one, something only humans can inherently understand and appreciate, since for all the reasons I just brought up, as well as what Aigis says herself here, a pure AI or robot would be hard-pressed to find anything exceptionally noteworthy about this photo. But what's more, Aigis gets a fun and wholesome interaction with some of her other friends, and no matter what dialogue option you choose, it's Aigis who suggests they all take a group photo together. Again, these photos would be nothing special in a technical sense, but because of Aigis' very human bonds with the other three, these pictures become worth way more than what words alone could describe. Plus, like I mentioned earlier in this video, I think this is another great example of how Reload built on Caesar's bonds with one another, all in a way that feels organic and natural to this more reserved cast. This scene in particular has really stayed with me. But also, speaking of the Platonic social link roots, I'd be remiss not to talk about them in general. First off, thank goodness they exist as an option. What do you know? Men and women can be just friends, wow! But more importantly, thank goodness it's not as jarring anymore to progress multiple girls' social links. Like, I get the OG devs didn't think players would be doing all the SLs in the first place, but come on. The mandatory romance has always been one of the most immersion-breaking aspects of this game for me and GL, and always felt especially off regarding the girl party members. Like, you're telling me I'm supposed to believe he's dating all of them while they're all living under the same roof? Yeah, no. Though at least it birthed this great headcanon I've seen floating around, that this is the reason Ryoji is such a flirt when he first appears. He has no other frame of reference but the protagonist, damn it! And this is probably not intentional, but it sorta feels like Reload lampshade / pokes fun at this old forced romance mechanic in Ryoji's first Link episode. Anyway, I was not expecting such wholesome additional content from these new friendship roots. I love how much self-growth there is in many of these new rank ups, Chihiro's rank 10 being a standout in particular, especially considering how she was arguably the most reliant on the protag of all the SLs back in FES. Now it's just really cool to see her take charge of her own life for once. As for the girl party members, it's so nice to see other C's teammates show up in some of the final rank ups. As I just mentioned in the previous section, Yukari, Fuuka, and Junpei pop up in Aigis' Platonic rank 10, meanwhile Yukari appears in Fuuka's max rank. I always enjoy seeing more interaction among C's, and these new scenes definitely help scratch that itch. Fuuka also shows up in Ryoji's final Link episode, and so with that, let's go ahead and move on to his section. Now I'd like to take a moment to ask that if you've enjoyed the video so far and haven't liked it yet, I'd really appreciate you doing so for the algorithms. And since you've made it this far, tell me in the comments who your favorite P3 character is and what moment or activity of theirs is your favorite in Reload. I'd also like to thank all my patrons and channel members once again. I truly thank you for your patience and for supporting me like this. Though ultimately, even just watching, liking, commenting, and sharing my videos do so much for me and my channel, and I'm always grateful for all of you. Ryoji arguably has the biggest evolution across all the iterations of Persona 3. Starting with the original PS2 era games, as far as I could tell, it seems most players felt apathy at best towards him. Like, it's still crazy to me that the only true interaction he has with the MC is during the Kyoto trip. And it's just the hot spring, haha funny, but not really moment at that. He and Protag never interacted on a one-on-one basis, so it was understandably difficult to buy into any part of the narrative that acted like they developed some sort of friendship, which in turn severely diminished the significance of the decision to kill Ryoji or not in December, a topic I'll return to later on in this section. Now, Persona 3 Portable remedied things a lot by giving him a social link in the FemC route, an expansion that did quite a bit for his characterization, including establishing a more substantial relationship with the protag. Reload definitely took note of this, and what's more, introduced him more naturally into the game's story. In particular, I'm referring to the new intro scene of just him and Protag completing a task for Toriumi, not to mention really playing up the Kaworu XP references this time around. The new Link episodes also contain more foreshadowing as to his true identity. One aspect of this being that he's compassionate due to having learned how to empathize with humanity during the time he was still Pharaohs and living vicariously through the protag. As I already analyzed in my P3 mythology video, even though Ryoji is Thanatos and the avatar of Nyx in P3 lore, so essentially death incarnate, death as a general concept isn't an entirely evil thing. It just happens to be a part of life on Earth. So Ryoji giving C's the option to die peacefully, albeit ignorant to when their final breath will actually come, highlights this somewhat benevolent and kind aspect of Nyx. And since we're talking about Nyx, this is a good time for me to bring up Ryoji's new voice direction. I also fell into the camp that found the deeper pitch kinda off-putting at first, similar to my first impressions of Akihiko's new voice in-game. But much like that performance, I came around to reload Ryoji later, specifically once we got to the Moonlight Bridge reveals in December. I actually found the deeper pitch oddly fitting in hindsight for foreshadowing purposes, for lack of a better term. I just feel like it can be viewed as a hint to Ryoji's true nature all along, that he's as old as time itself, given he's the Death Arcana and avatar of Nyx, the latter of which is the origin of the human psyche in Persona's lore. Now, interestingly enough, his relationship with Aigis is also less hostile. The voice direction itself in the big Moonlight Bridge confrontation is toned down, but Reload also takes from P3 Portable and completely ditches the line in FES where he kinda provokes her. Quote, "You don't really like me, do you?" This brings me back to a point I made in Aigis' section, that her gardening activity just further demonstrates her budding ability to consider all perspectives. And so, at least to me, all this combined makes Ryoji's apology to her and her response to him on the last day of December feel like it actually means something, unlike FES. But to return to the caring aspect of his personality, the brand new career experience scene also shines a spotlight on this. Ryoji is incredibly concerned over Junpei, and while he doesn't know what actually happened, that Junpei has just lost Chidori, he can tell that Junpei is really down and just wishes he could cheer him up. Quote, "He doesn't like seeing his friends in pain," which points to the option he'll give everyone in December. Though, speaking of those two's friendship, it's established way more and much earlier too. Take Ryoji's first Link episode. He says he's already gone out and grabbed ramen with Junpei before. Then there are more main scenes where Ryoji just naturally hangs out around Junpei's desk. Some small tweaks in the optional dialogue sell the closeness too. Like on December 1st, Junpei's updated lines are him actively wanting to hang out with Ryoji, but then he realizes he doesn't even know where the guy lives. Then there's the Kyoto school trip that depicts Junpei, Ryoji, and Protag having fun together as a trio, something that wasn't really a thing in FES, which focused more on depicting just Junpei and Ryoji as buds. And not only that, but it's pretty significant that Ryoji is in the brand new Reload group photo with all the other C's members on the trip. More on this shortly. But since Ryoji has more main narrative and optional scenes prior to Kyoto, it makes his interactions with the protag here, like when they first arrive at the hotel, feel way less awkward. So in other words, he no longer feels completely shoehorned in, having been more interwoven into the story via Reload's changes. So I'm of the mind that his new Link episodes, the altered Kyoto trip, and the new career experience stuff combined have added some kind of emotional weight / tension to the kill him or not decision. Or well, it did for me at least. Like, don't get me wrong, P3 FES always nailed this choice from a thematic perspective, that even though it's more subtle than Reload when it comes to the theme of living a full life means making memories with others, and it's these precious memories that make up such a fundamental part of the human experience. Like, since all of this is still a core message of OG Persona 3, it's therefore going against said themes to accept a memory wipe. But as for Reload, this remake also utilizes the Ryoji friendship aspect better. It's the protagonist who checks on Ryoji after he collapses on the Moonlight Bridge. Meanwhile, in FES, it was Fuuka who did it. MC didn't even budge. And then December 31st actually rolls around. Ryoji reminds the MC that he's gonna disappear anyway, so he shouldn't hesitate to kill him. But if we're being real here, most people wouldn't want to have their friend's blood on their hands. This is even in cases like an assisted S-word scenario where the friend is terminally ill and on hospice care. So yeah, the having to kill a friend factor in this decision feels more significant in Reload, and I do appreciate the devs' best efforts to make it so. Now, to wrap up this section on Ryoji, I thought the little music box / tune thing that was carried across the Link episodes and into the final decision day was really sweet. A nice little memento. Memento Mori that is okay, yeah. Sorry. I didn't even make sense with that one. That wasn't even funny. Okay, whatever, back on topic. I'm still holding out hope for the day that Atlas implements the gay and or lesbian option that does not end with death and tragedy. But I guess we'll see. Now, out of all the changes and evolutions in Reload, the music is probably where most of my mixed feelings lie, so I'll be splitting this section into two main points. The first is that I think many of the endgame songs have lost much of their emotional weight, unfortunately, because the motifs within them were not given proper focus during the course of Reload. By the way, by motif, I'm referring to leitmotif, or a recurrent theme that normally represents a character, a place, and or an overall idea or concept. With all this in mind, the examples that suffered the biggest loss to me are the Living with Determination remix in the dorm and the Burn My Dread track when facing Nyx's primordial form. The thing is, Reload has replaced a large amount of scenes that used to play Living with Determination with the new sad version of the Joy OST. You know, the track that's most often played in the social links. The motif of it is echoed in Memories of the School and Memories of You. So when it comes to Living with Determination, it's nice that the main narrative moments still use this track. However, unless you're someone who doesn't do social links at all, which I think makes up a minority of first-time playthroughs, the usage rate of Living with Determination to the newer sorrowful Joy track feels minuscule in comparison. Another thing that seems to compound this is that the Joy motif is not only played all the time in the social links, but also in the main story and in so much of the other optional content, meaning the player just has way more time to form an attachment to this track since it plays so often. Meanwhile, for Living with Determination, the only other place where even an inkling of this motif is heard, as far as I know, is in the Voice Someone Calls, i.e. the Tartarus Lobby theme. Now, I clearly can't speak for the first-time Persona 3 players, since I'm clearly not one, but I can't help but imagine the new January dorm theme just not hitting as hard, like way less of an emotionally hype gut punch, and instead maybe just a, hey, this sounds cool reaction. But of course, I'd love to hear what you thought about this if Reload is your first time experiencing Persona 3. The Burn My Dread Last Battle track is sorta in a similar predicament and actually reminds me a bit of what happened with Life Will Change when Persona 5 Royal came out. So for those of you who are only familiar with P5R, Vanilla P5's opening featured the song Wake Up, Get Out There, with its chorus popping up again as the main motif every time we hear the chorus of Life Will Change. Now as for Persona 3, its first ever original opening song was Burn My Dread, and not only that, but the PS2 era's opening cutscene has the protag listening to the same exact version of the song that plays in the next True Form battle. Portable also has this playing in Yukari's opening Evoker scene. Now, Reload's opening cutscene, in contrast, has no music playing in the background at all. I'm not here to argue when silence is actually more impactful or not. Right now, I'd just like you to imagine how much more emotionally invested and hype a FES player probably is to hear this return compared to someone who has experienced Reload only. Well, okay, I get that even a lot of FES people forgot it played in that first cutscene. But even if we scratch that point, it still stands that it's the motif of the opening song. So at least for me, when I heard this for the first time in the final battle, it just felt like such an epic way to bookend Persona 3's story. Plus, it's kinda cool to picture the protag hyping themselves up, playing a song they're canonically shown to play on their MP3 player early in the game, so probably a favorite of theirs. But to return to Reload, the thing is, I actually like its updated remix of Burn My Dread Last Battle, especially the vocals, which place greater emphasis on the dissonant chords this time. So it's just too bad that the emotional weight of this track has been diminished. Now, to transition into my second major point about the music, the arrangement of certain tracks are just very head-scratching in technical and stylistic changes. My personal observation is that a good chunk of the OSTs have lost their musicality, or in other words, what gave them character. And unlike most of the other evolutions in Reload regarding characters or atmosphere, the changes here don't really feel like they serve a purpose. So much like in literature, music should also tell a story. Think of the notes as words on a page. A good story has moments of highs and lows all in the journey to the climax, right? Well, a good composition of music kinda does the same thing. But not only that, a really important tool in a musician's arsenal is called phrasing. This is when stylistic interpretation is added. How loud or how soft to play, how much accent and emphasis to place on certain notes, and so on. All in an effort to convey a story, many different feelings, a theme, you get the point. So regarding the dynamics in Reload's arrangements of P3's soundtrack, I've personally found that the OSTs still follow the general changes of soft to loud in the original from like verse to chorus to bridge. Like, if I can do another book analogy, it's like Reload is still able to make the passages within the story feel distinct from one another, like the original did more or less, and basically build from passage to passage. However, the OG soundtrack not only does all of that, but it also has way better phrasing. By that, I'm referring to all the subtle nuances and techniques, oftentimes within just a single musical phrase, that paint a more expressive story or scene. Now, there are a number of tracks I could talk about, but for time's sake, I'm only going to focus on 3 of them. The first one is the new Velvet Room retake. In the original, around the 1 minute to 1 minute 10 second mark, there's this generally ascending line in the bass voices that, when accompanying the strings and vocalist just adds so much fullness and power. Meanwhile, the new version of this track puts no emphasis on this at all, mostly leaving it to this super soft left-hand piano, and it's just so milquetoast in contrast. And then when you get to the climax of this piece around the 2:17 mark, I think the original has the better balancing of all the different phrases, like the melody, counter melodies, general harmony going on at the same time. Like the volume of the low, middle, and high voices, as well as all the different instrumental groups, complement each other well. Meanwhile, the new version just feels messier to me with this balancing. The arpeggios of the piano are too quiet and also lost a lot of the accent, not gonna lie. The middle brass voices are too loud, while the bassline voices aren't loud enough. Stuff like that. But moving on to another evolution that just baffled me is Battle for Everyone's Souls! Oh my god! What happened? So this brings me to another thing I've generally noticed about Reload's soundtrack, and that's how it's really hit or miss when it comes to percussion choices. For Battle of Everyone's Soul, the loss of that driving synth beat at 20 seconds in is already sad enough, but losing the overall build-up from the drums from the 13 to 23 second mark is especially tragic. In a similar light at the 2:21 timestamp, in the original you really feel a marked change when this part hits because the quick 16th notes completely stop. Meanwhile, Reload doesn't even include that same energizing percussive line at all during the big grandiose Velvet Room section, and the desperation, the urgency, the tension of this fight is just not captured as well without it. What's more, there's no change in the drum beat at all. No distinguishable difference in rhythm or phrasing that leaves you feeling like some big shakeup just happened once the operatic part is finished. Meaning, Reload's arrangement doesn't quite capture the same emotion of arriving at what I can only describe as uneasy reverie, like the original track does. The shift from the quicker 16th notes back to just an 8th note drum beat can emulate C's finally getting a chance to catch their breath during the fight. Or the way I viewed it in the original especially is a certain feeling of hopelessness that maybe Nyx really can't be brought down every time Moonless Gown goes up. finally, the track that I think was the hardest hit of all, Unavoidable Battle. My god, the entire purpose of this track was just... I have so much to say, but before I really get into what and why, I'd like to bring up another thing I generally noticed about Reload's arrangements. Many tracks sound way too sterile, as in lacking the same groove and flow of the OG versions, like from the guitar and bass tones to the overall synth sounds to the electric drum kit / percussion. All of the new instrumentation sounds very clean and polished, and while this isn't a problem with the more pop-inspired or even like jazzy tracks, so the overworld themes for instance, in fact, I think Reload has improved on those particular OSTs. However, it's the more rock-based tracks that have really suffered. So much like Battle for Everyone's Souls, the biggest change and loss here, in my opinion, has to do with the percussion. The original track is so driven by this quick drum lick, which was always accompanied by a really snappy rim shot technique. Now, I'm not a drummer, so any drummer in the comments feel free to explain this better than me, but rim shots are basically when you hit the center of the snare and the side, so the rim at the same time. This is usually meant to express a more energetic and/or aggressive feel. Here are some examples in the OG Unavoidable Battle. Now what's more, the rim shot is sometimes even used to imitate / symbolize stun fire. Just replace the S with a G. Don't demonetize me, YouTube. And well, this does play whenever we fight Revolver Jesus. So overall, what I'm getting at is that removing this from the track is a huge problem, since the entire point of this OST is to set up an aggressive / hostile pace. It only plays when Protag awakens his persona for the first time, whenever we fight the enemy group Strega, and the optional Liz battle, the latter of which is the most punishing fight in the game. The loss of this drum lick also draws awkward attention to this weird choice of more staccato, in other words separated, notes in the guitars and bass. This gives such a weird jolty, choppy feeling to me, and I hate to say it, but it sounds kinda clownish. Not at all the cool groove this track should embody. You see, it's the drums that took on the role of punchy accent and separation in the original track, all which allowed room for the guitar and bass lines to play more legato / smooth phrases, without sacrificing any of the youthful punchiness or energy this track should have. Now, at least the new arrangement sorta gets it together by the 22-second mark with the guitars. But even later, at around the 103 timestamp, there's like some weird bongo drum sounding shit instead of that typical drum kit, which just doesn't fit the image this track needs. Now, thankfully, there's a version of Reload's Unavoidable Battle, but with the original drum / percussion done by Junpei VA. What a fitting name for a guy restoring Strega's theme back to glory, by the way. But alas, I hope my thoughts and explanations were clear for these handful of songs. I know I'm not the greatest with precise word choice, so I did my best and I appreciate you bearing with me. Now, since I've been so critical of the music so far, you might find this hard to believe, but I do have plenty of tracks I prefer over their original counterparts. One is Master of Shadow. I already loved this OST from the FES days, and I think Reload only improved on it. The synths sound a lot cleaner and better balanced, like it overall feels like a fuller track now that I can actually hear all the different voices going on at once, though I do think the original still does dynamic contrast better. Anyway, I like that the new vocals bring out and balance the dissonant harmony more as well, which adds to the general uneasiness and creepy feeling this track is meant to express. Plus, I especially love this new little bass lick from around the 102 to 105 timestamp, which, as far as I can tell, was not in the original. And I mentioned earlier, I prefer Reload's take on both school themes, Want to Be Close and the new Changing Seasons. Sorry, not sorry to all the French people out there. And then there's the brand new Color Your Night Nighttime theme. Lotus Juice feel-good vibes plus Azumi Takahashi's soulful vocals. It's just, perfection. A great bop to just chill to. So to wrap up this music section, I think most of the songs that were always more obviously synth-heavy, so by that I mean the clearly computer/machine emulating sounds, are a step up in Reload, though the ones that mainly feature more classic instrumentation, so both the orchestral and rock-oriented ones, have been very hit or miss. Alright, now on to the final month and overall endgame of Reload. So they saved the color palette swap just for January, which is interesting to say the least. If I had to choose where to place the swap for dramatic effect, I personally would have picked December right after Ryoji tells us the truth about Nyx's inevitable arrival. I can imagine some players would want it after Shinji's death, others may want it after Ikutsuki's betrayal, but I'd argue the Nyx news is the most devastating since it's the only situation where there are no second chances. What I mean here is that for the other tragic moments prior, at least characters like Ken, Akihiko, Yukari, Mitsuru, and so on can carry the memories of their loved ones into the future as they continue to live their lives. But the Nyx news? That's just straight up game over. With that in mind, something I loved about this part of the game was the improved detail of the town slowly descending into a one-part chaotic, one-part lethargic mess. The accumulating trash, cult posters, and sheer number of lost really captured that doomsday vibe to me. Not that FES didn't have these things too. It's just that this new engine was able to capture the true terrifying scale of it. But to return to the muted color swap, if they were saving something like this for Endgame, I just wish they would have gone for consistency for every aspect of it, meaning Tartarus and the Promised Day too. It's not as noticeable in Tartarus's final block since it's all black and white anyway, but it would have been nice if they toned down the saturation for the in-engine very top of the tower. It still looks exactly how the Dark Hour has appeared throughout the game, and if they were attempting the same stylistic contrast as the dorm and the town, well, lighting that's closer to these final animated cutscenes instead of what we actually got for the Nyx fight would have been more consistent. As for the battle itself, there are a number of really cool additions. One may seem small, but it has to do with Fuuka and her scanning. Given her arc throughout the game and her social link and how she started off with such self-doubt, it's cool how her dialogue in Reload, as well as her improved voice direction, reflects that journey to self-confidence so much better.
It doesn't matter how much he changes Arcana, I'll get him no matter what!
The new party member dynamic voice lines are a nice little touch too. They seem to happen every once in a while when Nyx switches Arcana, so stuff like this.
I have to be strong, but that's Please watch over me.
Now, though I was a bit critical of the stage earlier, I do like how Nick's avatar visually builds on itself during the fight, like obtaining the glowing sword with the shift to Emperor, the feathers with the Hierophant, and then the big one for me is when all the Arcana pop up before the infamous mega move Night Queen. Cause you guys know how much of a sucker I am for the tarot symbolism and everything. Like seriously, the protag gets all his extra power from his social links and via accumulating Arcana in Tartarus the entire game. And Nyx is essentially the Kirijo's manufactured parallel. So yeah, I just like seeing the Arcana manifest like this before ultra powerful move happens. Speaking of all the Arcana, what a fitting addition to have Nick's avatar use the same moves as the previous full moon bosses. Though if I had to pick one thing I was disappointed by here, it was the removal of Nyx's double turn mechanic. It just nerfs so much of the tension and grandiose nature of this fight. Or well, it does exist, but it's only saved for the Hanged Man phase in Reload, which was also the only time I felt somewhat put on the ropes during this fight, and I even tried hard not to be too overleveled going into this too. But getting to the finale of Persona 3 story, oh my god, this is where the fully voiced social links hit right in the feels, guys! That familiarity! I legitimately cried hearing all those voices again as Protag obtains the Universe Arcana. But as for the animated cutscenes in this final segment of the game, I've already broken down the general evolution in stylistic choices in the first hour of this analysis, but long story short, Reload is going for more explicit details in everything from dialogue to visuals. Definitely different. I still prefer the older visuals myself, but I can't say they're not beautiful in their own right. And well, ultimately, we do get our miracle, and spring returns to the world once more. The cherry blossom trees lining the school walkways and the petals being swept away in the breeze, well, technically this isn't quite accurate since usually these flowers don't bloom until mid to late March at earliest IRL, but close enough, right? Anyways, what an amazing visual addition by Reload. It definitely takes a page out of Portable's background since back in FES, these petals were something only depicted in the final scene with Aigis on the rooftop. That's why it was all so stunning to me when I first booted up Reload. Definitely one of my favorite new things of all the stuff I noticed early on in this remake. So seeing the cherry blossoms here at the very end too, bookmarking the year and the story, like, who put these feels here? Because you see, cherry blossoms or sakura hold a lot of meaning in Japanese culture and are a staple symbol across all the artistic mediums. The flower itself is beautiful, but since the blooming season is so short-lived, just a few short weeks, it captures how fleeting life is. And because of how it's been used in the idealized stories of warriors and samurai, i.e. old classic literature, across so many periods of Japanese history, it's often come to symbolize a life that's vibrant but short-lived. Just truly encompassing the concept mono no aware, which basically means remember the transience and ephemeral nature of life. Now on the flip side, cherry blossom viewing is a common and traditional custom observed each year in Japan. These viewing parties are referred to as hanami during the day and yozakura if done during the evening. My main point here being that sakura are just as mundane as they are grandiose in their symbolism, which really mirrors the main concept Aigis reflects on during the final scene with the protag. And it's all of these things combined that makes the gorgeous visuals of the cherry blossoms here just so moving to me. Like, I just can't help but think, what a fitting tribute to all the characters who have come and gone in Persona 3's one-year journey, including the protag on this very day. So, Persona 3 Reload was in development from 2019 to 2023, right? And, well, I can't imagine a world where the direction or style or just some part of this game wasn't influenced in some shape or form by the big global epidemic. Just replace the E with a P. Cause unless you're someone like me who was already a hermit prior to 2020, it was completely life-altering. And trigger warning, by the way, I won't be talking in any major detail about what happened in those years, but I will be talking about this topic generally for this entire section. So, perhaps this influence can be found in Reload's evolution from Memento Mori aesthetic to something more like nostalgia, like something warmer, you know, creating memories while we still can, since you never know when something insane like a global disease can put a halt to everything. Or maybe the influence is focused in the new additional content like the dorm activities. You see, it's these kinds of additions where I can't help but wonder if there was some deeper underlying intentionality, like perhaps this was a way for the developers to offer certain opportunities, albeit vicariously, that so many people missed out on and will probably never get back. Yeah, I'm referring to all the young folk who were in high school and or undergraduate studies when the big C virus hit. So many things were completely cancelled, while life just continued to spin on with no chance to go back and do the age/grade level related milestones that have already passed in the meantime, right? And I get there are plenty of people out there who like to dunk on or clown on these school-related experiences, from things like prom to the dorm life in college, calling it cringe and all this shit. But the reality is there are just as many people who did want to experience those things as there are people who couldn't care less about them. It's the fact people didn't get an option to choose whether they wanted to participate or not. That's the problem or sad part to me. And not only that, there was just so much lost opportunity to hang out in person with friends at a developmental stage of life, so adolescence, where peer relations like that are so important. So yeah, I'm just trying to acknowledge a collective trauma that I feel doesn't always get the credit it deserves. And I don't know, maybe some devs had it in the back of their minds that the dorm stuff could give young adults who had high school and or college just fly by a la remote classes an opportunity to at least live vicariously through this game? Like, sure, Persona 3 isn't the only Persona game that has social sim elements like these, but something that is unique to P3 is its dorm setting, especially now that Reload has expanded upon it. Even something as mundane as group study sessions weren't on the table for years due to social distancing. And, well, I admit that this all hits particularly close to home for me as well. I can just really empathize. Long story short, this is pre-C virus epidemic, but my own college experience was a roller coaster of a journey after I was diagnosed with a severe neurological condition right in the middle of it. I had years in between where my only focus was just recovering my ability to walk and do daily living activities, recover my independence after becoming paralyzed. I transferred to different institutions and finally ended up doing the final 1.5 years of my degree online. So basically, the last half of my undergrad education was done from home, and a vast majority of the stuff that characterizes the last couple years of the college experience, like things I was pragmatically planning for since my freshman year, like doing a semester abroad, were just thrown out the window. And now the truth is, a good portion of my life nowadays is lived vicariously through video games, and I'm very grateful to the people who make this medium possible. Like, I understand I do come from a place of privilege in many ways, such as me even getting to mention this stuff I had planned in university. But the thing is, in general, it's really sad that people can be so dismissive and say it's not that big of a deal to have missed it. Like, people try so hard to play the tragedy Olympics. Oh, missing out on fun activities is nothing compared to the C virus killing my dad or my sibling, my partner, my friend, insert a loved one here. or whatever other tragedy people will try and bring up. But please, never forget your feelings are valid. Someone else's grief and tragedy should never prevent you from acknowledging your own sadness and stage in life. So, sort of related note, sort of weird transition, but something I wanted to bring up. Akinari has been a fan favorite social link since the OG Persona 3 days, and I'd say he's even more so now with Reload's voiceover. People sympathize and, or better yet, empathize with him a lot. And yet, how many players even stop to consider that out of all the characters, Akinari is the most likely to only have a shot at these kinds of experiences via something like video games? So, on a similar note, many young adults from 2020 to now, they missed a time in their life that they're allowed to grieve. And not only that, people who ended up getting long C virus, and in the US alone it's estimated that around 17 million people are affected by this, many don't even get a chance to do fun stuff as an adult. I just wanted to throw this out there since I've seen a common response thrown around that, oh, well, life doesn't start until you're an adult anyway. And while that's true for many people, for those of us who are chronically ill, many of us who have mobility issues, we won't ever get to travel to certain places or try certain demanding activities. Like, being an adult doesn't really change that for us. Now, I do want to acknowledge the more critical and even cynical way of looking at the additional parasocial events in P3 Reload thanks to late-stage capitalism, where all the corporations just want us to get attached to their characters and form connections to their stories, their multiverses, so we continue to buy their stuff instead of, like, forming connections to real-life people. It's definitely a valid and troubling thing to keep in mind, for sure. However, the Persona series has always been very invested in the theme of building connections and relationships with others for decades and prior to the big epidemic, so it at least feels very natural to me for Atlus to include all these new optional hangout activities in a game like Reload. Anyway, I guess the reason I wanted to include this section was that 1, Atlus has always been very intentional with addressing the current state of society with their games. For example, see my video on OG P3 and apathy syndrome. So I don't think it's too far of a reach to speculate how the C virus may have impacted this game. And 2, I wanted those of you who could relate to any of the experiences I brought up about missing things know that, hey, I see you and I hear you. I do think that collective loss gets forgotten and swept under the rug a lot. So, this closing point may seem kinda cringe at first, but please just stick with me here. Even if you know nothing about the other series I'm about to cover, I swear you don't need to, and all of this will have a point. So, as a longtime fan of both Persona and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, it never ceases to amaze me how each passing year only confirms this one particular observation that's always stood out to me, and even more so now that Persona 3 Reload is out. And that's the utter similarity in the fandom/meta discourse surrounding Persona 3 and JoJo's Part 3 respectively. And what the hell do I mean by this? Well, out of all the other parts in their series, they both have the most adaptations and versions of themselves, none of which are truly considered the perfect version. Please, just hear me out. Like, tell me this doesn't sound familiar. The OG JoJo's Part 3 manga is the way to experience everything. It has the best pacing. I'm telling you, you just have to watch the Persona 3 movies. The OVA has the best Dio fight and an oppressive atmosphere that actually fits the harrowing nature of the final leg of the journey. Persona 3 FES aesthetic is hands down the best, and makes the most stylistic sense. Heritage for the Future is so fun with the additional content, like I can't believe they made these other characters playable. you can't not try the exclusive FemC route in P3 Portable. The David Pro anime is king and the best overall way to experience JoJo's. Persona 3 Reload is the only one to recommend from now on, bros. Like, oh my god, it never ends. And I haven't even mentioned all the fan-made stuff for these third entries into the series. But that's a topic for another time and another day. Anyways, I don't think it's a coincidence that to this day, both Persona 3 and JoJo's Part 3 are still my favorites in each of the respective series. So, sort of brief tangent, it's always been a meme that Persona copies JoJo's, am I right? But like, for real, there are tons of really cool similarities in themes and narrative across many of the respective numbered parts, as well as in the meta/IRL discourse that go beyond the more obvious parallels. For instance, in P3 and Part 3's case, the tarot bosses and a dog joins the party! Oh, funny enough, doing a serious, in-depth comparative analysis has been a video idea of mine for pretty much as long as I've been uploading to this channel. But would anyone actually want to see that? Like, okay, if this video somehow gets 7,000 likes, I'll do it, guys. I'll do it for show. Well, to return to why Persona 3 and Part 3 have stuck around as my faves, there's just something about the imperfections that fascinate me and that I can't help but respect. I guess ultimately what I'm getting at is that for me, it doesn't matter what iteration I find these characters or this story in. For some reason, I can never turn them away, and I can't help but find something to like about any given version or adaptation. It's just something about the cast and their camaraderie, the both mundane and grandiose weight of the plot, and the rocky but fulfilling journey that just outshines any imperfections the narrative or character writing has on a technical level. They're both the part that really shook the boat of their respective series, and you could tell the first iterations of them especially, so PS2 Persona 3 and the Part 3 manga, were just a lot of trial and error, containing flaws, whether that be complaints about pacing, game mechanics, balancing of characters, etc., that later entries in the series mostly cleaned up. And yet, there's something that's just so heartfelt about that effort from both the devs and author respectively, that in the end I can't help but acknowledge as a genuine triumph of the human spirit, both within the fictional stories themselves and on a real-life meta level. Persona 3 and JoJo's Part 3 are more than the sum of their parts to me, and leave me with this complicated yet beautiful feeling that reminds me to cherish things while they last. And no matter what new iteration of P3 or Part 3 they release, you can bet I'll be there no matter what. So yeah, maybe this is a cop-out answer, but I genuinely feel like I can't choose which version of Persona 3 I like best now. I feel it depends on my mood. FES is the most novel when it comes to overall tone and ludonarrative elements, and I'll always love it for that. But there are so many additions in the Evolved Reload that I love too. Anyway, I hope it's clear as day that this analysis was very much a huge passion project that was 3 months in the making. It took longer than usual too, since my health has been pretty iffy this entire year so far. But please, like and subscribe, it truly helps with the algorithm. Check out my other socials, and finally, I truly want to thank all my patrons and channel members for continuing to support and make this possible. Especially my Special Fusion supporters, Big Clingy, Sam Bezjak, Francesco Santoyo Rego, M. Meownalin, Platinum Rose, Malcolm Lowry, Unholy Biscuit, Peter Shepard, Andy, Jimmy Tapiz, Frank Sasaki, and Sugar Free Mocha.